Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I know it's early, so thanks so much for making it here. My name is Phil Triandafilopoulos. I'm a professor of political science here at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and am acting director of the Harney program in Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies this year. I'm really happy that you can all be here for this special event. And I want to share greetings from the Harney program's director, my colleague and friend, Professor Adjetey, who's on leave and can't join us today. As most of you know, the former director of the Harney program, Professor Jeffrey Reitz, retired recently. Today's event is a tribute to Jeff's contributions to the Harney program, to the Monk School, to the University of Toronto, and the academic discipline of sociology generally, and migration studies in particular, both here in Canada and internationally. A few words about our guest of honor. Jeffrey Reitz is Professor Emeritus of Sociology and R.F. Harney Professor Emeritus of Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies at the University of Toronto. Jeff received his PhD in sociology from Columbia University in 1972, was a full-time faculty member at the University of Toronto from 1970 to 2021, and served as chair of the Department of Sociology from 1980 to 1985. For the quantitatively challenged like me, Jeff was a full-time professor at the University of Toronto for 51 years doing teaching, research, and service. You can only imagine how many other contributions Jeff's made in his career. I can tell you about a few. He was appointed the director of the R.F. Harney, well, in 1999. I had to learn about this, actually, because I got it wrong initially in our promo. In 1999, he was appointed as the R.F. Harney Professor and Director of the Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies program, and subsequently established the Harney program at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. So Jeff, you said I was wrong, but I was half wrong. You were the founding director of part of the program at the Monk School. His book, Warmth of Welcome, The Social Causes of Economic Success for Immigrants in Different Nations and Cities, which was published in 1998, was recognized by the Thomas and Znajniecki Book Awards of the American Sociological Association. Jeff was elected as Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2001 and received the Outstanding Contribution to Canadian Sociology Award from the Canadian Sociological Association in 2005. He's held distinguished visiting positions at a number of institutions, including the Mackenzie King Chair in Canadian Studies at Harvard University, at l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and at the City University of New York's Graduate Center. A few interesting facts about Jeff culled from his personal website, which I encourage you to visit. As an undergraduate, Jeff majored in mathematics and planned to pursue a career in engineering, and became interested in the social sciences after he ran into some luminaries at Columbia, including Professor Paul Lazarsfeld and C. Wright Mills. Jeff's interest in immigration and race relations were also shaped by his experiences both living in New York City in the 1960s as a graduate student and growing up in the American Midwest. In his own words, quote, "The civil rights movement and growing urban unrest showed clearly the damage done by America's troubling failure to confront and address its racist history," unquote. Jeff's academic interest in these topics developed after he moved to Toronto to take up his position at the U of T through his collaboration with colleagues, especially Professors Raymond Breton, Vesvolod Issagiu, Jeff's predecessor and the first Harney professor, and Warren Kalbach. Jeff's work in the 70s and 80s focused on Canada and increasingly with comparisons between Canada and the United States, with Great Britain, and through the years, a broader range of countries through intensive and exceptionally productive collaborations with colleagues in France, Mexico, and elsewhere. Jeff took on the role of R.F. Harney Professor and Director of the Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies program in 1999, and molded the program through his careful stewardship over the next 2 decades. I got to know Jeff during this time, first as a PhD student from another university, then as a postdoc here at U of T, and then as a fellow faculty member and colleague. And what stood out to me, whether I was a nobody from another university who he didn't have to spend any time with or help at all, or a postdoc with very little social capital, or a colleague, is he always treated me exceptionally well, and he treats everyone exceptionally well. He's generous with his time and advice, and he's always honest. He'll tell you what's going well and what's not going so well with your work, and that's a rare commodity in Canadian academia. Too often people say, that's great, and that's it. Jeff won't stop with that's great. Sometimes he'll say, that's terrible, but then explain why it's terrible and how it could be better. Jeff, importantly, is also a devoted sidekick to his wonderful partner, Donna, who I know he loves very much. Finally, Jeff is a wonderful friend with a clear and well-considered set of opinions, a taste for good food and music and drink, and a sharp sense of humor. He's an enemy of injustice, an enemy of discrimination, and a proponent of a more just and caring world. He is a mensch. There's much more that I could say, but I'm gonna let others say much more. We have a fantastic program today. I wanna thank everyone who's taking part in the panel, and I'd like to thank our keynote lecturer, who I'll introduce formally later. This panel features three of Jeff's former doctoral students, who I'd like to introduce now. Rupa Banerjee is Associate Professor of Human Resource Management at Toronto Metropolitan University and Canadian Research Chair of Economic Inclusion, Employment, and Entrepreneurship of Canada's Immigrants. Her research examines employment outcomes of newcomers, a topic on which she has published extensively. Her research interests also include diversity and ethno-racial discrimination in the workplace. Dr. Banerjee's current program of research focuses on the role of post-secondary institutions and employers on the migration and labor market integration of temporary residents and immigrants in Canada. Rupa's research is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and has appeared in leading journals in the fields of immigration and labor. Her work has contributed to the awareness of implicit bias in hiring practices and the development of a digital app that facilitates newcomer access to information and resources for settlement in Canada. Wendell Ni Laryea Adjetey is William Dawson Chair, Assistant Professor and Specialist in Post-Reconstruction U.S. and African Diaspora History at McGill University. He is the author of Cross-Border Cosmopolitans, The Making of a Pan-African North America, published by the University of North Carolina Press. Professor Adjetey is working on 2 new book projects. The first examines 19th century African-led abolitionism and warfare along the Gulf of the Guinea coast. The second interrogates the roots of counterinsurgency in the United States and the Americas broadly from the 1870s to the 1970s. Adjetey is back-to-back recipient of McGill's 2 teaching commendations. First, the Principal's Prize for Excellence in Teaching, which he won recently in 2023, and in 2022, the H. Knoll Fieldhouse Award for Distinguished Teaching. That's an amazing achievement, back-to-back teaching awards. He earned his, I just did that, what I always think I comment on Donald Trump doing as he's reading his text. He stops and says, hey, that's interesting. But that is interesting. That's really great. Wendell earned his honors BA from the University of Toronto. He was a student at St. Michael's College and his master's in ethnic immigration and pluralism studies and political science, also at the U of T. He earned his PhD, MA, and MPhil from Yale University. And before pursuing his academic career, Wendell worked in youth gang prevention and intervention in North Toronto. Emily Laxer is Associate Professor of Sociology at York University's Glendon campus, where she holds a York Research Chair in Populism, Rights, and Legality. Dr. Laxer's research has addressed both the political underpinnings and community-based effects of state policies concerning minorities' citizenship rights and belonging. This research has had particular implications for understanding debates over restricting Islamic religious signs in comparative societies. International in scope, Emily's work has been published in English and French in peer-reviewed journals in the fields of immigration, nationalism, and politics. Her research also forms the basis of a sole-authored monograph titled Unveiling the Nation, The Politics of Secularism in France and Quebec, which received the John Porter Tradition of Excellence Book Award from the Canadian Sociological Association in 2020. Professor Laxer's current research program explores the relationship between contemporary populist political movements and articulations of rights and legality in Canada. So, a really distinguished panel, and I'm so thankful that they all agreed to come and join us today. Each will speak for roughly 15 to 20 minutes, and following the remarks, we'll open the floor to questions from you, our audience here, and our audience online. Following the panel, just a bit of scheduling. Following this panel, we'll break for coffee and refreshments, and then we'll return here at 11 sharp, at which time our keynote lecturer, Professor Richard Alba, will give his address. Following Richard's talk and a few questions, Jeff will address us, and then we'll break for lunch together. Okay, please begin.
Just get my sheets ready. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for turning out so bright and early, and I know a lot of people are also joining online. Today I have the distinct honor of presenting to you the remarkable contributions of Professor Jeff Reitz to the field of migration studies, ethnicity, integration, the list goes on and on. So I first met Jeff when I was a master's student at the Center for Industrial Relations, just down the road, back in 2001. As a 1.5 generation immigrant, I was vaguely interested in researching something related to immigration and the experiences of immigrants. That's pretty much all I knew at that moment. So I started to read. Among the first Canadian research that I encountered was the work of Jeffrey G. Reitz. So imagine my surprise when I stumbled on Jeff at the center one day. Suddenly, I was faced with the towering figure of academic eminence, and I've had a full-on fangirl moment. Much to my relief, Jeff proved to be incredibly approachable and supportive. Despite my initial apprehension, he was remarkably open and willing to offer guidance. He recommended that I enroll in his master's seminar in the Harney program. This was a pivotal moment for me, an unexpected opportunity to learn from a leading scholar in the field. Sitting in Jeff's class solidified my admiration for his expertise and, more importantly, his generosity towards his students. Jeff then offered me an RA-ship to work on his project on multiculturalism and social cohesion with Professors Ray Breton and the late Karen and Ken Dion. Engaging in this project proved to be a profound learning experience. As I delved into analyzing Statistics Canada data, I frequently found myself grappling with uncertainty. Admittedly, I stumbled a lot and made my fair share of mistakes along the way. I remember instances when I presented my findings to Jeff, only to discover the next day that my conclusions were entirely off the mark, and in fact, upon closer examination, I found the results were exactly the opposite of what I reported to him. So then I had to sheepishly call him back and say everything was wrong. Throughout all of it, Jeff demonstrated remarkable patience and unwavering support. His guidance was invaluable as I navigated the complexities of data analysis and learned how to effectively interpret and contextualize results. ultimately honing my analytical skills and fostering a deeper understanding of the entire research process. The other valuable lesson I got from this early experience was the dynamic of collaborating with a team of seasoned and esteemed researchers. While the discussions within the group were frequently contentious and loud, they were always respectful and ultimately fostered a deeper exploration of ideas and theories, pushing me to refine my own perspectives and viewpoints. I was just a student RA, but my voice was not only heard, but it was valued, and this laid the first foundation of building my confidence as a scholar. I know that I'm not the only student that has benefited from Jeff's mentorship in this way. Over nearly 5 decades, Jeff has directly supervised 23 PhD students, as per his CV, and provided guidance to countless others like me. Even after I finished my PhD and started my own academic career, I continued to co-author with Jeff regularly, and thus I continue to learn from him. In fact, I will always consider myself Jeff's student. I was recently invited to a conference, and before calling me up to present, the organizer confessed that he had actually invited Jeff, but he wasn't available, so then I was asked to present because I was Jeff's student. So I found it amusing but fitting that even after more than 15 years post-graduation, I'm still considered Jeff Reitz' student. Jeff commenced his academic journey from a background in math, but his intellectual curiosity and passion for social sciences led him to pursue sociology. From the very beginning, this interdisciplinary background shaped his unique approach to understanding complex societal phenomenon. One of the hallmarks of Jeff's scholarship is his steadfast commitment to interdisciplinary collaboration. As a founding member of the Multiculturalism program at the University of Toronto, he actively participated in shaping national surveys, policy discussions on minority language groups. His involvement with the Social Planning Council of Metro Toronto and the Toronto Mayor's Committee on Community and Race Relations really underscores his dedication to bringing academic research into real-world issues. Throughout his career, Jeff has demonstrated a keen interest in comparative research, delving into cross-national examinations of immigration and ethnic relations. His seminal book, Warmth of the Welcome, pioneered a comprehensive analysis of immigrant economic success across Canada, the US, and Australia, shedding light on the complicated interplay between social policies, cultural attitudes, and labor market dynamics. So Jeff's contributions are many, but I would categorize his unique approach into 3 areas. First, Jeff always challenges grand narratives that often cloak complex societal issues. He focuses on the nuances and questions the often taken for granted determinants of social phenomena. For example, he confronted the myth of Canadian exceptionalism very early, daring to question the status quo that assumes that Canadian multiculturalism presents the perfect model of inclusivity. Through his research, Jeff unpacked the layers of complexity inherent in Canadian society and revealed the systemic inequalities and barriers that undermine the idealized image of multicultural harmony. This work served as a wake-up call, urging scholars and policymakers alike to critically examine the realities of diversity and integration in Canada. Of course, now we see from the latest opinion surveys that Canada's exceptionalism is not infallible, as Canadians have become increasingly more negative towards immigration than they have been in many decades, challenging the longstanding narrative of Canada as a beacon of inclusivity. Second, Jeff's work has always been firmly grounded in empirical data. He goes beyond mere theoretical discourse and delves into the real experiences of everyday people. Through his analyses, he's unearthed the structural issues that often evade the spotlight, bringing attention to the challenges faced by marginalized communities. So one example is his involvement in landmark cases brought before human rights commissions, the Canadian Human Rights Commission. His expert testimony highlighted systemic discrimination in employment practices and shed light on the challenges faced by immigrants in accessing employment opportunities. Through his unwavering commitment to empirical research, Jeff has been able to provide evidence to influence policy change. Third, although Jeff's utilized various research methods over the years, His exploitation of quantitative data sources is particularly noteworthy. Jeff has skillfully applied statistical analyses to unearth narratives that might otherwise remain obscured. For example, over a decade ago, Jeff and his collaborators recalculated the economic impact of immigrant skill underutilization in Canada, building on an earlier analysis from the early 2000s. Despite the passage of time, these statistics still remain cited even today because there's an absence of equally compelling evidence on the topic since then. In the field of migration studies, there's a prevalent misconception that economists hold the monopoly on producing rigorous quantitative analysis. But Jeff has shattered this stereotype with his body of work. His contributions underscore the importance of non-economists engaging in quantitative analysis. Jeff's work serves as a testament to the importance of challenging disciplinary boundaries in advancing knowledge. So I'm always impressed with Jeff's unending scholarly curiosity and innovative approaches to doing research. Here's an example. In order to better understand hiring discrimination among Canadian employers, he came up with a way to expand the already innovative audit study conducted by Phil Oreopoulos that showed significantly lower callback rates for job applicants with Asian-sounding names. Jeff proposed augmenting the dataset with employer characteristics. This simple expansion allowed us to extract more nuanced insights into the organizational factors shaping discriminatory behavior. Furthermore, this reanalysis not only highlighted the importance of Phil's original study, but also played a role in influencing the federal government's 2017 name-blind recruitment pilot. Even in retirement, Jeff's passion for research remains undiminished. A couple of years ago, when he had already semi-retired at least, we met for lunch, and our conversation veered into the evolving profile and experiences of young second-generation immigrants today. I remarked on the differences that I observed in my students compared to those in earlier decades, for example, those that I grew up with. Despite already having extensively studied second-generation outcomes decades ago, I mean, there are a few things that Jeff hasn't studied, he enthusiastically proposed undertaking a new study on this topic. And this led to our current collaboration with Wendell, Adjetey, and Feng Ho from Statistics Canada. I also greatly admire Jeff's ability to garner media and policy attention to his research findings. His scholarly endeavors are never confined to the ivory tower. They stem from a profound dedication to affecting tangible change in the world. Jeff possesses a remarkable ability to spotlight the significance of his research and advocate for transformative action. Whether he's championing inclusive immigration policies or advocating for reforms in the labor market, Jeff's impact transcends academic boundaries. Finally, I want to say that Jeff has not only been my mentor in academic terms, but also in how to balance one's academic and personal lives. Although Jeff's incredibly passionate about his research, he always prioritizes his life. He travels extensively with Donna every year and still engages in his creative pursuits like music or talking about his car, and demonstrates that a fulfilling life encompasses diverse interests and pursuits. Somehow, Jeff manages to gracefully juggle all of these things, effortlessly blending academic rigor with fun and making it all appear seamless. Over the years, I have asked Jeff to write probably one too many letters of support or reference, and he's always gone above and beyond to support my career. For some reason, despite all the mistakes I made back when I was a student RA, he continued to believe in me, and for that, I am eternally grateful. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm tempted to say I agree with everything Rupa said. Thank you so much, Phil, for inviting me to be here today. It is truly an honor to be here spending time with you all to reflect on and celebrate the remarkable career accomplishments and contributions of Jeff Reitz. I've known Jeff in many different capacities over the years, beginning as a graduate student in his ethnic studies course at U of T, then later working as a research assistant on his comparative study of Muslims incorporation in France, Quebec, and the rest of Canada, and more recently as a collaborator on additional articles that have emanated from that study. To say that these experiences were formative to me, both professionally and personally, is a gross understatement. My identity as a sociologist is inextricably linked to and embedded in what I regard as an ongoing conversation that I've been having with Jeff for more than a decade. It's difficult to distill the contributions, as Rupa has already pointed out, that Jeff has made to the sociology of migration and to the discipline more broadly, as they are so wide-reaching. As a graduate student learning the fundamentals, my presumptions about the equitable nature and success of Canadian immigration and multiculturalism policy were pretty quickly called into question by Jeff's ground-shifting discoveries about immigrants' skill underutilization, or about the uneven economic and social trajectories of second-generation Canadians. I also learned to think about the broad institutional underpinnings of these trajectories, discovering how the warmth of welcome embedded in countries' distinct systems of education, labor markets, and social welfare impact the fates of immigrant cohorts in different national settings. But it was in working alongside Jeff that I gained a real appreciation of the way he attains these insights. One of the first things that I discovered is that Jeff is fundamentally truth-seeking and non-dogmatic in his approach to empirical research. He comes to the table with questions, many of them, and no prescribed answers. This disposition manifests, I think, among other things, in Jeff's suspicion of grand or simplifying narratives about the world, particularly about how state policies and discourses dictate immigrants' trajectories of incorporation. A lot of the existing research in this area conforms to this idea that national models, such as multiculturalism in Canada or republicanism in France, sort of provide the keys to understanding the diversity of those trajectories across settings. But for Jeff, the story is always more complicated. I think a recurring insight of his work is that really understanding the immigrant experience requires a multivariate approach that attends to the compounding effects of various institutions, various societal institutions, including those outside the sort of immigration nexus, and that considers the on-the-ground, real, daily, lived experiences of immigrant communities. So Jeff's commitment to these principles really provided the blueprint for our exploration of Muslims incorporation in France, Quebec, and English Canada. Jeff spearheaded this project in 2012, obtaining a SSHRC grant and a Marie Curie fellowship to examine the social, economic, and political aspects of Muslims' integration across these three settings, using both large-scale quantitative surveys and qualitative data based on interviews and focus groups. He, thankfully, enlisted the invaluable collaboration of Patrick Simon, an expert on immigration and ethnic diversity at the Institut National des Études Démographiques in Paris, with whom we worked closely on several co-authored articles. At the time that we began the study, public and academic discourse on the topic offered a fairly succinct, kind of simple story. Muslims are worse off in France, where a Republican national model precludes recognition of ethnic and religious diversity in favor of a colorblind secularism, than they are in English Canada, where an official multiculturalism policy celebrates and promotes such diversity. Patterns in Quebec, we assumed, should lie somewhere in between, given the presence of an intercultural model that welcomes diversity so long as it doesn't disrupt the kind of value that's attributed to a common French-speaking public culture. 12 years and 9 publications later, the story is far less convincing, thanks to the research that Jeff initiated. Despite the differing grand narratives present, we found that minorities of non-European origins in France, Quebec, and English Canada, especially Muslims, experience significant, strikingly similarly significant barriers in terms of their social inclusion, their economic prosperity, and their political participation. At the social level, we found Muslim minorities in all three settings to be more likely than their non-Muslim counterparts to experience discrimination, while reporting fewer positive networks outside their communities, as well as lower levels of trust, participation, and identification with the mainstream society. In terms of economic prosperity, we observed high levels of labor market earnings discrimination in all three settings. Where we did find evidence of cross-national differences, for instance, intergenerational trajectories in household income were flat in France versus upward in Canada. Further investigation revealed those differences to be the result of a series of factors, some of which operate beyond the level of national models. So things like minorities' differing socioeconomic profiles, country-specific labor market structures, welfare policies. With respect to political and civic participation, we found differences in Muslim citizenship acquisition, with far lower rates reported in France, but we actually found that the gap in voter turnout between Muslims and the mainstream was considerably larger in Canada than it was in France. These discoveries certainly brought important substantive evidence to bear on a larger body of research that challenges the kind of celebratory narrative around Canadian multiculturalism. But to me, they held even broader theoretical value. First, they showed with remarkable clarity this disjuncture between the public discourses that prescribe the boundaries of identity on the one hand, and the lived experiences of communities that are subject to, but also actively engage with those boundaries on the other. I think a desire to kind of comprehend the sources and the nature of these kinds of disjunctures is a recurring element of Jeff's larger body of research. Second, the study, like so much of Jeff's work, highlighted the necessity of a multivariate approach to resolving debates about what enables versus impedes minorities' successful incorporation. In the case of Muslims, we found that individual outcomes were hugely dependent on interactions between larger societal factors and an array of individual characteristics like national origin, age, education, generation status. Jeff ensured that we exhausted every avenue in this regard, leaving no mechanism of inclusion or exclusion unexplored. Hence, some of the dizzying number of tables in some of our articles that cover all of these bases. Third, the study further reminded us that societal institutions outside the purview of immigration and integration policies, like the labor market, significantly impact immigrant trajectories. So for example, Canada may promote economic opportunities for newcomers by being highly skill selective in its immigration policy or by combating employment discrimination. But this cannot and does not wholly make up for the negative effects of its harsh neoliberal labor market conditions, particularly for recent immigrants. And finally, I think the study, like so much of Jeff's work, emphasized the complexity of relationships among meanings attached to race and religion, both in public perceptions, but also in the daily lives of immigrant communities. Racialization and attitudes to religion are, of course, both in theory and practice, impossible to separate, as research on Islamophobia has made abundantly clear. But our study demonstrated that public attitudes to religion matter somewhat more in shaping Muslims' economic integration in France, whereas race is a slightly more significant factor in Canada. Especially valuable to me was the qualitative dimension of the study, which foregrounded the beliefs and attitudes and behaviors of Muslim community members themselves in all three cases. As always, Jeff was not satisfied to draw conclusions based on public opinion data or even large-scale survey evidence. He wanted to know just how people felt in their homes, in their schools, at work, and in the larger public sphere. Based on focus groups and interviews that he himself and a team of RAs conducted with Muslim men and women, we co-authored an article with PhD candidate Jessica Stallone that examined headscarf-wearing women's responses to exclusionary boundaries erected by states and by publics in France, Quebec, and English Canada. And I think what we found was really important. Headscarf-wearing women in all three settings encountered hostility and the erection of boundaries with significant cost to their emotional well-being. Cognitively, they responded by rejecting the premise of the exclusion and seeking to dispel stereotypes about what the headscarf symbolizes. When it came to their behavioral responses, though, we found significant differences across national settings, with national models playing a more significant role. In Canada, where multiculturalism broadly delegitimizes discrimination of all kinds, our respondents were more likely to interpret exclusion as a violation of their rights and to act and respond accordingly. In France, by contrast, their reactions depended on the setting. So where the exclusion of the headscarf was mandated by law, such as in public schools and in certain workplaces, women complied either by removing the headscarf or leaving the workforce. But in settings where the headscarf was not formally banned, but exclusions nevertheless occurred, women in France took measures to resist the mistreatment. These discoveries, which highlight Muslim women's agency in the navigation of social boundaries, would not have been possible without Jeff's insistence on a mixed method approach as a way to access the subjective experiences of integration, not something that a primarily quantitative scholar often does. So like most social scientists, Jeff's work is about measuring and comprehending relationships. But it is also, as I have learned and come to admire and come to try to emulate, fundamentally built on relationships with students, colleagues, and friends. As many of us have observed and experienced firsthand, Jeff's career has been and continues to be profoundly collaborative. Some of these collaborations are decades long, as in the case of Raymond Breton, with whom Jeff began publishing in the 1980s. I've come to realize that this collaborative element is no accident, but rather a measure of Jeff's interest in engaging with different perspectives and learning from others. I and many other students lucky enough to work with Jeff have benefited immensely from this. From the moment I was hired as a PhD student to work on the France, Quebec, and English Canada project, I was made to feel like a valued and respected member of a team. I was lucky enough to spend time in Paris with Jeff, where he included me in meetings with Patrick at INED, gave me the opportunity to showcase my work at an invited workshop where I was able to forge relationships that were hugely beneficial to me in my dissertation on French secularism, and where I attended dinner parties that he and Donna hosted at their fabulous apartment overlooking the Luxembourg Gardens. In Toronto, we met regularly throughout the rest of my graduate studies and beyond, poring over endless tables of results at the Research Data Center, debating, shall I say perhaps even arguing, over the merits of different regression models and interpretations. When Patrick was in town, Jeff arranged for us to visit mosques in the city, where we participated in prayer and later joined community members for dinner. Throughout these experiences and observing the way Jeff operated, I learned valuable lessons about how to survive and even thrive in the academic world. There is no guide to navigating academic life, as many of us know, and as a PhD student and postdoctoral fellow, it can be daunting and alienating, particularly in the face of a harsh job market. Only a few of us are lucky enough to encounter mentors who are willing to show us the ropes and perhaps as importantly, lend us that bit of confidence to make the journey. Jeff's unfailingly generous, supportive, and non-hierarchical mentorship has been without question one of the greatest gifts of my life and career. I also learned from Jeff that a curious and engaged life outside of work not only brings fulfillment, it makes one a better scholar. Indeed, when he isn't planning his next article, analyzing data, or meeting with students and collaborators, Jeff is absorbed in other pursuits, such as travel, learning new languages, taking in live jazz shows in New York City, and even performing himself in the chorus of the Toronto City Opera. Everywhere he goes, Jeff forges meaningful local connections, often leading to new collaborations. I believe that these pursuits inform Jeff's identity and impact as a scholar. They resonate with his larger commitment to a public sociology that seeks to engage and inform audiences outside academia. Jeff's research never ends with a scholarly publication. He invariably turns to the next phase of mobilizing and translating his findings such that they might have tangible impacts on public debates and policy, and dare I say, on people's lives. We live in an age where knowledge, fact, and science itself are subject to polarizing debates, misinformation, and disinformation. Our social and political climate is increasingly dogmatic, with distrust and even contempt of experts gaining prevalence. I've witnessed this firsthand in my research on populist movements and discourses in Canada. Growing in reach and intensity, these movements and discourses gain resonance by offering simple explanations for complex social phenomena and opting for conflict over consensus. At times, the prospects for positive change based on careful and deliberate analysis appear narrowed or foreclosed. In revisiting Jeff's work for this panel, I've been reminded not only of the value, but of the necessity of rigorous empirical research to expose the messy, sometimes inconvenient truths about our social world. His body of work, which continues to evolve, is a lasting testament to the power and change-making capacity of social science research. I look forward to the next phase in my years-long conversation with Jeff Reitz, because it certainly isn't over yet. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Good morning. Okay. I come from a culture and a people who believe steadfastly in this notion of call and response. So when we invoke something or engage the universe, we expect reciprocity of sorts. My name is Wendell ni Laryea Adjetey. My kinsmen and my kinswomen on the African continent and other parts of the African world refer to me as Ni Laryea Osabu Kenklemo Atrekowe Oblahinko Oblayamanche. In all things, first and foremost, I give thanks to the Creator, indeed to the God of my ancestors, the covenant of my ancestors. Osabu Olate Gidi Gidi Begbete Beti Katamanso Tacha Bochukwon Bonyaga Nunko Nunko Kejebwa Mokobegba. I give thanks to the spirit of my ancestors, Atrekowe Sisajin Yancho. I'm immensely honored to have this opportunity to share words of affection, words of adulation for Jeff Reitz. I'm immensely honored that you are all here present with us. I want to thank Rupa and Emily for their brilliant remarks. I don't know how one can follow in your stead, but thank you for such rich remarks. Thank you, Phil, for your vision, your encouragement, for gathering all of us here today, your sense of generosity to honor such a remarkable mensch, as you put it, a wonderful academic statesman as Jeff Reitz. Again, thank you to members of the U of T community, the broader Toronto community, those who are gathered online. First, to honor Jeff Reitz. I have a few remarks which will unfold in more or less 4 parts. But I want to make sure that I do not overspeak, because academics have a tendency to do that, and I am trying desperately not to be that person. So I'm going to say something very briefly about my area of specialization. I'm a historian of the United States. At least I was trained as a historian of the United States and the African diaspora. I, in a sense, am an interloper among very accomplished sociologists. So you might appreciate that sometimes I'll invoke anecdotes, and the historian knows the value of telling stories or sharing stories. My 4-part presentation. So the first part, I'll speak very briefly about the context in which Professor Reitz and I met back in 2008, and how that would lead me on a certain trajectory. The second part will examine the power of perspective and how invaluable it is to all scholars, but certainly in a discipline like sociology. The third part will explore briefly notions of what I'm calling the comparative model, or the integrated or integrative model. And then lastly, the fourth part, I'll speak very briefly about a particular ethic or trait that is invaluable in terms of good and great scholarship. So I arrived at the University of Toronto 2004 as a first-generation high school graduate. My parents, working poor West African immigrants, knew nothing about the world of academia. They'd never been given such an opportunity to self-actualize in that sense. In fact, the first time my father went to high school, he was employed by the Toronto District School Board as a caretaker, as a custodian, a janitor. And so I arrived at U of T, completed 4 years of undergraduate studies, and then started my MA in political science and ethnic immigration pluralism studies in September 2008. And so, of course, I was enrolled in the mandatory seminar, the graduate seminar on ethnicity, immigration, and pluralism. And I, of course, meet the eminent Jeff Reitz. I meet Professor Reitz, and I am studious and shy and coy and all these sort of weirdly academic things. But I meet this incredibly generous man, this unbelievably smart, brilliant, well-read, well-written man, well-published man. And so Professor Reitz and I would commiserate. I would meet him during office hours. I would share with him my research, not only for the seminar, but sort of broader academic interest and where I felt pulled in terms of my own engagement with community life, community affairs, Black Toronto, etc. And so I tell Professor Reitz, I'm thinking about next steps. I mean, I've been at U of T for, this is my 5th year, 2008-2009 academic year was my 5th year. I share with him that I want to move away from academic life and perhaps work and pay back like my student loans and engage in some hands-on activity that might complement the academic things that I had learned at U of T. And so we discussed various doctoral programs. I mentioned that, I feel pulled towards history because so many of the issues that are in many ways so present and manifest in our inner city communities in this city and throughout the region, without a proper historical analysis, it would be virtually impossible to address these issues. And so I applied to the doctoral program here at U of T in the Department of History. And Professor Reitz was enthusiastic, and he wrote me an enthusiastic letter of recommendation. And come, I think, March or maybe April, sometime in like the winter or the spring, I find out, much to my shock and awe, that I had been denied admission into the doctoral program in history at U of T. And so I, had my head down, and I'm disappointed, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what is this existential crisis? And so I march on to the 3rd floor to where Professor Reitz's office was located here in the Monk School, and I tell him, I'm so sorry to disappoint you, because I'm thinking now, if I didn't get in, I've literally let down one of my academic mentors who wrote a letter of recommendation for me. And he says, this is horseshit. And I'm thinking, I know I've really screwed up. I wasn't good enough. And he's thinking, no, this is horseshit. I'm going to contact the department, which he does. And he follows up with some of the senior members in the department. And then he and I meet again. And he's like, you know what? These people are not going to understand what it is that you're trying to do. They're simply not going to appreciate it. And this was a very profound conversation that he and I had. He said, they're simply not going to appreciate it. You need to go to the United States. You need to think about doctoral work, and when you're ready to pursue doctoral work, you need to go to the United States. In part because Canada remained provincial. Canada remained parochial. Canada was not, and remained still not, fully aware of itself. And as somebody aspiring to become a historian, I thought, okay, as a white man coming from the United States who lived in New York City and in a place like New York City and Manhattan, near Harlem, and has this assessment of Canada, there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. Although I didn't know it empirically, but viscerally I could tell there's truth to his assessment. And so my secret, some of my students at McGill might know this, but my secret, I don't talk about it often because I still feel a semblance of shame about it. I went to Yale because the University of Toronto denied me admission to its doctoral program. Such is life. And so when I was admitted, Jeff's like, and I was admitted to all these schools in the United States on a full ride. He's like, I told you, they're just not going to get it here. Go to the United States, you'll find scholars, you'll find academic mentors for whom this will be invaluable because you're bringing a perspective and a mode of analysis that will enrich the academic environment. And so that set me on this particular trajectory. And I cannot thank you enough because the work that I did in the United States, the research, the academic collaborations that have unfolded as a result of my going to the US, and everything else that sort of came into motion. So much of it is attributable to a generous academic mentor who had the wherewithal and the courage and the decency and kindness to tell me, like, don't give up just because this big behemoth of a public institution says you're not worthy to study here. So that is the first note. The second note, the power of perspective, right? And in essence, what Emily and Rupa have alluded to, challenging orthodoxy. And it is a very daunting premise to challenge orthodoxy in the academy. But I certainly appreciate this about Professor Reitz and his sense of courage, his enterprising spirit where challenging orthodoxy is concerned. Good, in fact, great sociology requires cross-pollination of sorts, cross-pollination of methods, whether it is qualitative and quantitative, whether it's a comparative forms of analysis. In fact, moving from various institutions or geographical spaces, but great sociology requires the semblance of cross-pollination. And Professor Reitz's work models this methodology. In essence, we see, again, in the very accomplished sociologists, that there is a desire, or at least like an inkling to leave one's comfort zone, right? To engage people and contexts outside of our own. And Professor Reitz models this in so many ways. There is, I would say, as much currency and as much power in bringing fresh perspectives to challenge orthodoxy and other grand narratives. And so when we think about Jeff's own genesis story, right, his migration story from Minnesota to New York City to Columbia, right, and what Gilbert Osofsky, a great historian of Harlem and the making of a black ghetto in Harlem, what Osofsky would refer to as Harlem's backyard. Washington Heights, I think you guys call it, right? Washington Heights, Harlem, or Morningside Heights, yes. So like Harlem's backyard, at a time when the United States is undergoing seismic tectonic shifts in the 1960s, where there are all types of concerns about internal subversives and external subversives. But there's power when we look at Jeff's own story and how that transition of sorts from middle America to a place that is unbelievably worldly and cosmopolitan and teeming with all types of diversity and complexities and literally described as sort of the epicenter of the world. And this proximity, I've discerned Jeff's proximity to a place like Harlem, Black America, at a time when the U.S. is undergoing all these shifts, certainly had an indelible impact. And Phil, you alluded to this in terms of the context of what was happening in the United States during civil rights, black militancy, black power, etc. In the 60s, of course, was a time of disruption, a decade of disruption, a time of acute learning. And so when I think about my own trajectory, when I think about my work as a historian, in comparison to Jeff's work as a pioneering sociologist, it makes a great deal of sense that an American like Jeff arrives in Canadian society in 1970 and immediately, like almost immediately, is able to discern the contradictions, the shortcomings of Canadian society, and also the importance of critiquing a national culture predicated on exceptionalism or notions of Canadian exceptionalism vis-a-vis the United States, especially this notion that Canada was somehow much more racially progressive. And this false cultural consciousness of exceptionalism illustrated the limitations of multiculturalism, and Rupa, you spoke to this. And indeed, this shortcoming of multiculturalism in a society that really and truly lacked self-awareness. And as a side note, when I think of your work, Jeff, and I think of your trajectory in coming to the University of Toronto, coming to Canadian society, I'm reminded of a very prominent American-Canadian sociologist as well, incidentally, who preceded you to Canada by a couple decades. He came here, I think, in 1950, 1951. Daniel Grafton Hill III. And Daniel Hill was a sociologist as well, earned his PhD here at the University of Toronto, African-American man. He would go on to become a pioneering human rights activist and human rights, intellectual of human rights history and systems of human rights in the post-war period. And in fact, he was the inaugural director of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And of course, again, Rupa, you alluded to Jeff's penchant for bringing his intellectual work together with advocacy, especially within these human rights bodies in Canadian society. Part 3, the comparative model, or as I will call it, the integrated model. So, trained as a historian of the United States, part of my work, or a significant portion of my work, looks at U.S. history from, I would say, a very different vantage point from many of my peers who were trained alongside me at Yale and other institutions, whether in the United States or Canada. So I think of U.S. history as U.S. history vis-a-vis or within the context of the hemisphere, or U.S. history within the context of the North American mainland, or U.S. history in the context of transatlantic relations. And when we look at the United States from these perspectives, these truly comparative or integrated perspectives, we are able to reach new conclusions, new syntheses in terms of how the United States has operated, how in many ways the U.S. empire relates to the rest of the world, but specifically the North American continent, specifically to Canada, and specifically to other nations within the hemisphere, within the Americas. And Jeff's commentary when I was an undergraduate here, and certainly when I was an MA student, and even when I went to the United States, Jeff's commentary on the United States, his work on the United States and Canada, in so many ways sharpened my thinking, it sharpened my analysis, because it underscored that there is a lot of, again, currency and power when we can look at nations, look at peoples across borders, look at institutions across borders in this type of analytical framework. And so it goes without saying, really, that robust scholarship reflects rigorous training. But I want to be circumspect, or in fact, even a little introspective here. Proper training alone did not produce the eminent and well-published Jeff Reitz and widely cited Jeff Reitz. Robust scholarship indeed requires perspective. And sometimes we lose sight of that as academics. We become very insular. We become very Canadian. We become parochial. We become provincial. But robust scholarship needs, or in fact necessitates, this element of perspective, this broad perspective, which one cannot necessarily teach and one cannot necessarily assimilate. The scholarly perspective, in some ways, I would say, is akin to what another great sociologist, often now described as a founding father of urban sociology in the United States, that is the African-American W.E.B. Du Bois, what Du Bois referred to as the veil, right? And the veil of U.S. race relations or anti-blackness in the United States, right? The veil that in so many ways conditions how we see the world. And so it is this scholarly perspective that can help us navigate the veil, something that more or less can be an encumbrance, but the capacity to navigate this veil allows us to see sort of new perspectives. And I think this is what I was able to get from my association, my mentor-mentee, and now friendship with Jeff Reitz. And so whether one is comparing, whether one is contrasting, whether one is juxtaposing U.S. and Canadian race relations or Canadian race relations vis-a-vis France or Australia or Britain, there is much that we can uncover in terms of the intricacies of our societies, right? Of these various societies. There's so much that we can discern and in fact maybe delineate in terms of how people are living, what factors are shaping their material security, how they're imagining a semblance of freedom, a semblance of dignity. In many ways, as Emily alluded to in her work on France and Quebec. So that's what I've tried to do in my work, my scholarship as a historian of the United States, of Canada, of North America, and of the African diaspora. It is partly this comparative approach, and more accurately, I would say this integrative model of historical analysis. And it's about cross-pollination, bringing scholars, and in fact, bringing our research actors into conversation, looking at systems of power, looking at modes of analysis within a comparative, integrative model. And briefly, I'll mention that part of the reason why I think the work that I was able to do in the United States was so attractive to many of my advisors there and other senior historians that I've met is that there's a perspective of Canadian society that I was able to bring and a perspective of U.S. society that I was able to bring as an African from the continent, not as an ethnic African American whose peoples had, or whose direct lineal ancestors had endured sort of a genocidal form of Jim Crow for centuries, but as an outsider who understood that Canada was only this beacon of hope principally in the colonial period because the British understood the game of geopolitics very, very astutely. And so Canada and Upper Canada and Lower Canada and Canadian sort of colonial experiment, the British could position this vast geographical territory as, in fact, this refuge point of sorts for the enslaved in the United States. And by positioning Canada or colonial Canada vis-a-vis the United States, Canada was able to achieve what a great historian of North America and the British Empire, Robin Winks, called a bludgeoning effect on the economic systems of the United States. So it wasn't because Canada was inherently good and great and more progressive, but Canada was a geopolitical strategy. And this is the perspective that I arrived in the United States with, which really and drastically changed so much. And lastly, because I've already gone over the 20-minute mark, and I ask for your patience as I conclude my remarks, the great scholar, the great sociologist, really and truly must have this ethic of empathy, right? How do you relate to human beings? Whether they're Muslim immigrants, whether they're first-generation persons of other backgrounds, whether they're racial minorities, persons of the LGBTQ community, et cetera, et cetera. How do you relate to individuals for whom access to institutional support and power often feels like a mirage, right? How do you relate to said peoples? And it is very obvious that Professor Reitz, Jeff Reitz, is an incredible scholar, an incredible social scientist and humanist because he can relate to human beings. He can relate to ordinary peoples. And indeed, he has this visceral hatred of injustice. And you should hear him sort of going off on injustice sometimes, whether you're having dinner or something. He gets very worked up and he really hates injustice. But it is that sense, it is that ethos of being empathetic and relating to people. And sometimes we do academic work that comes across as sterile. It's almost as if we're just speaking with or to other academics, and then we shelve our work. But as Rupa mentioned, Jeff is so adept. He's so deft when it comes to making sure that governments and media and other public-facing individuals and institutions engage with this work so that we can arrive at policies that can improve people's material conditions. And this requires being non-judgmental, right? It requires, again, walking alongside people, speaking with people, not speaking at people. And so in essence and in sum, Jeff, I've mentioned this name already, but I will mention it again because he symbolizes so much to people of African descent, but also to the United States, and that is W.E. Du Bois, since you're both sociologists, but Du Bois wore so many hats. But as a sociologist, I think what made Du Bois such a potent scholar and intellectual was that he could connect with people, and he was always aspiring to do that at every stage. And so you're in exceptional company, and I thank you truly for everything that you've done for me and my family. As I said, like, I'm coming from a context, my parents haven't even been to high school, right? And so navigating a place like U of T and then having really amazing scholars and mentors, elders who tell you, don't mind any negative feedback that you might receive. Just cast your net elsewhere. So thank you for that affirmation. Thank you for that encouragement. Thank you for what you've done, not only for me, but for clearly my now new friends and peers and colleagues. Thank you for what you've contributed to Canadian society.
Okay. Thanks so much, Rupa, Emily, Wendell. That was wonderful. So we have about 20 minutes, a little more than 20 minutes for questions from you here in our in-person audience and our audience online. Why don't we get started? Who's going to break the ice? Okay.
Thank you very much. I am not a sociologist. I'm not here as a sociologist. I have attended some Harney lectures, and that is primarily the reason I have elected to attend. Notwithstanding, I am very pleased or impressed with each of you, and I will outline briefly in terms of, say, Professor Wendell, who spoke last, so that's why he's impinged on my memory. And I do have a background in history as well as several other things. But what struck me, and I also say to the other two, is that we are living in fraught, fragile times. There is a fear. There is a fear, a felt imperative, and it is migrating into academe. And where is the courage in terms of speaking? And now we're witnessing protests down in the States, and I suspect many people don't quite understand exactly what they are protesting if you want to parse it right down to the fundamentals. And academics and sociology to a degree, is, as one said, it is nuance. It is a sense of expressing the veil, of trying to bind society, of what society is, and more importantly, what society is not. And if I were to pose a question to each of you briefly, what is your takeaway, notwithstanding your intersectionality with Professor Reitz? What is your perspective in terms of what you have gleaned and what you would like to share with your students ongoing? Thank you.
Sure. So thank you for your question and provocation. In terms of my takeaway for my students, if I understood correctly, my takeaway for my students, I guess a couple of things. First is the courage to speak and to speak up, the courage to engage in introspection and circumspection. It's very easy to exist in an academic milieu and sort of a social context where no one really challenges you. Everyone says what you want to hear, more or less. But the courage to push boundaries, to push back. And I always tell my students, you're actually, I'm empowering you, I'm encouraging you if there's something in an analysis or interpretation that I bring to the lecture hall or to the seminar with which you disagree, you're more than welcome to challenge anything that I say. My only precautionary note is that you do it respectfully with myself and among one another, right? So that courage to engage and to engage respectfully. And secondly, the power of empathy. And I think we lose sight of that, relating to people in a genuine way. And I don't mean empathy in this empty, rhetorical, liberal, nonsensical way that is sort of the veneer of Western society. I mean empathy in a sort of a genuine, sincere way of relating to people. We do a lot of pretending in Canada, and certainly there's a lot of pretending in the United States and Western Europe, et cetera. But that ability to relate to people genuinely, I think my students, I would love to impart that to them.
I mean, what he said, right? I mean, absolutely. And I guess I would add to that, to not be afraid to be uncomfortable. A lot of the courses I teach right now are on labor, labor relations, and also diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And a lot of the subjects that we discuss make people very uncomfortable. And so to live with that discomfort and actually use it as a superpower rather than as something to run away from, I think is also, I guess, something that Jeff taught me really is to not be afraid to be uncomfortable and to actually utilize that discomfort to try and make change. So.
Yeah, what they both said. I mean, I think the empathy point is an absolutely huge one. We don't do a lot of talking, relating, sharing across all kinds of boundaries, whether they be sort of ideological, regional, life circumstance. And I'm struck by how different the group of students in my courses are year to year. I mean, the different kinds of perspectives that they bring. One year it could be, I have mostly people who think a certain kind of way, but this year I had a lot of differences of opinion within my classroom. And I think part of what we need to do is, in addition to everything that's already been mentioned, welcome and appreciate differences of opinion with respect, and also not be afraid to be uncomfortable. I think also be confident in using the tools of our disciplines in a way that's sort of nimble to those shifts and changes that I have to sort of revise. I teach Principles of Sociology, which is our intro course. I have to sort of revise the way that I present the insights of the discipline to this changing and shifting generation and their changing experiences. The way that I taught it 5 years ago, the examples that I brought to the table aren't necessarily as resonant now as they were then. So, continue to be anchored in the tools that we have, but use them in a way that's applicable to changing kind of life circumstances and experiences of our students.
I'm going to follow up. Actually, I think that was a really good question. And Wendell, in talking about Jeff's migration to New York, you talked about the 60s and the kind of cataclysmic changes of the 60s. And, you know, I think speaking as an American, somebody from south of the border who lives in New York City, who went to Columbia at around the same time that Jeff did, and is witnessing the events of today, I think we're going through a similar kind of cataclysmic period, one that is potentially transformational in the sense that it is much more inclusive than was the movement of the 1960s, which was really a kind of white, middle-class, liberal movement. And this is not, and it's really challenging, obviously, some of the taken-for-granted truths of American life, and I think it reflects an upswelling of change with the young generation, and I wonder if you see the same thing here in Canada.
Thank you for that provocation, Richard. It's quite powerful what is unfolding south of the border across various academic campuses, and I have peers who are teaching at Barnard and at UT Austin and Yale and all these other places where students are organizing and demanding of their institutions to, in the same way that institutions in the 80s and early 90s demanded of, students at institutions demanded of their academic institutions to divest from South Africa and apartheid. Students are making similar demands of their institutions, their government, to divest from the Israeli government. This is a watershed moment. Without any equivocation, this is a watershed moment. The comparisons between the 1960s, 70s, and sort of this present moment really speaks to, in many ways, I would say like a regression of sorts, and that progress is never linear, and that we shouldn't ever think or, in fact, infer to our students that progress is linear, that like people work hard and they come together and then things naturally will improve and change, you know. And just to share a very quick anecdote with you, my doctoral advisor and chair and I, and along with others, had dinner in New Haven, September 2023. And this is one of the most eminent scholars of the United States in civil rights in the country. She grew up in North Carolina in a family of white supremacists. I mean, that was just the norm. There was nothing, there's no aberration about it, right? And she was telling us, you know, that everything that she's experienced, and even her career as a historian and writing about Jim Crow and civil rights and sort of the tumultuous 50s, 60s, and 70s, that even her as a historian, as an American from the Deep South, had come to a place where she thought, well, progress more or less is linear, right? That the United States was making meaningful change. And she paused and said, you know what, Wendell, I need to apologize to you and your generation. I got a little comfortable. My generation got a little comfortable in thinking that progress was linear. That, in fact, we don't know as much as we thought we knew about the United States. And that there are things happening in our own society, within our own governments, that we've actually not fully comprehended. And to me, that was very refreshing to hear an elder of mine, a very beloved elder of mine, sharing this with me in a similar way that I would share with my students, that we can't take anything for granted. And that backlash or, you know, regression is a very real phenomenon in terms of social change.
I'm going to turn it around to some of the most recent sort of evolution of what's been happening with Canadian immigration policy and what I've seen in my classroom with the growth of international students. And I mean, racialized students in general, certainly over the past 15 years, I've seen increase tremendously, but the growth of international students, the backlash towards international students, the discourse around temporary residence in Canada has shifted so much just before our eyes. And just in a similar way, right, not taking for granted that we've got this figured out, you know. We talked about, you know, interrogating the myth of exceptionalism. Jeff's been doing it for years, but now, more than ever, we really see how many cracks there are to that exceptionalism narrative in immigration policy. And I really noticed that in my interactions with students and with people around me. So I think that's something that, you know, is very stark and clear to me at the moment.
Yeah, to also take it in a slightly different direction, this notion of exceptionalism, this myth of exceptionalism, when you study sort of politics in Canada and populism in Canada, we always start the conversation with, you know, Canada's this exceptional case. You know, when Justin Trudeau was elected prime minister, and you had Trump on the other side, we had, you know, articles all over the world. In The Economist, the front page was sort of like, liberalism is alive and well in Canada, but, you know, the rest of the world is falling apart. You know, turns out that the cracks in that narrative are deeply apparent. And I also, you know, to bring it back to the classroom, I witnessed that in my classroom. A lot of students are drawn to some of this wave of sort of populist framing of the world and its issues. And that's very interesting to me because that wasn't the case 5 years ago. And so, you know, it speaks to the kind of nonlinear, not taking things for granted, ensuring that you're present and aware and engaged with what's happening in the moment, and with the students in your classroom who are probably more attuned to sort of the changing dynamics of the world in some ways than we are. But yeah.
I'd encourage anyone online, if they have a question, to pose it. We're monitoring you. But also anyone else here in our audience who might have a question. Yeah, very good.
Good morning. It's not a question, but maybe a note of thanks for giving us answers. Once in a while, there comes by a person who will open windows. We had a professor back home in India, and the moment he would enter the class, he would open windows. And I use that as a metaphor today. Professor Reitz, I'm a Harney fellow. He opened up a window decades back. It's still open. There's air coming in, there's light coming in, and the stale air is going out. So it's just a note of thanks from all the fellows at Harney for opening that window for us.
Room of academics, so few questions or comments. That's maybe it's too early, Jeff. I have a question for everyone on the panel. I want to hear your. You've shared a lot of reflections and anecdotes and stories, but I think you're still holding on to your best Jeff story. The one, maybe it was after you became, you know, the student professor relationship gave way to friendship, or maybe it was very early on, but there has to be an excellent story. Oh. You? Okay. Very good. Yeah. No. Sure. Where's the microphone? So you have your own best story about yourself?
No, I thought, is this on now?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought I would, while they're thinking about the best story.
Okay.
Just express my appreciation and gratitude to what's been said here today. It's very humbling to hear those opinions, and I really have no words to express my feelings about that. I just wanted to mention that it should be clear to everyone here, based on what you've heard, that these people are extremely talented, professional, hardworking, and now quite successful scholars that I've been very fortunate to have been associated with. You know, and I would say that it's collaboration is great. It's very fortunate. I like doing work on my own. There's gratification of solo work, but collaboration is fun. And but collaboration with students such as yourselves is special because it gives an opportunity to help guide people in their careers and to shape their approach to their work. And I wanted to say that what was appealing to me about working with you three, all three of you, is you share some, despite the disciplinary variety here, you share something very important to me, which is an approach to social science that's direct, plain-spoken, data-driven, and policy relevant. That's true for all of you, and it's not necessarily, you know, encountered everywhere in the classroom. And I would say, for example, Rupa came, she didn't mention this, she came with a previous experience in human resource management. And so she had on-the-ground experience. And that gave her a connection to reality that was an important feature, enabled you to be the kind of student and later scholar that you've become. Emily. Now, Emily, well, it's in her DNA to be policy-focused. I mean, she comes from a family, as we all know, a family of social scientists who were deeply engaged in progressive politics. She grew up with it from the time she was a little girl. And you can, when you listen to her talk, you can feel that there is an engagement there with the wider world that's fundamental to her interest in the social sciences. And then Wendell, well, Wendell was not only, you know, you described our initial encounters, and I was, you know, here's a man with deeply felt interests, very smart, very well informed, and all those things. And you know, I thought, here's a natural academic talent. But on top of that, he's been more engaged in the community than anyone I think I've ever met in my life. I mean, here he was not only working, as mentioned, working with youth in the community, at-risk youth, but he's also founded a foundation to help African kids get an education. I mean, you look at his CV and the kind of engagement and just the list of op-ed pieces he's written and so on, you'd think he'd be 80 years old. You know, it's really just astounding. I wonder where you get all the time. Where do you get all that time and energy? But that meant, you know, I mean, I mean, you've described it yourself. It shaped your approach to academic life. And so those resonated with me in each case. And Rupa, as for you, with the erroneous data, I forgot that completely. But I would say that my own mentor in university, and I think Richard's going to speak about him later, Paul Lazarsfeld. You know, the anecdote that is often repeated about him is that when a student came in, one of his research assistants, and said, you know, here's a finding, Professor Lazarsfeld. And Professor Lazarsfeld, oh, that's very, very interesting, and, you know, proceeded to discuss. Next day, the person came in and said, Professor Lazarsfeld, I'm so sorry, the finding was completely wrong. The truth is the opposite. And Lazarsfeld said, that's even more interesting. You know, on with that, which is, you know, like a very typical thing. You could, so, you know, as you've learned, people make mistakes. It's not, I do that all the time. And, you know, and you'll keep doing that too, and that's the way, but hopefully we catch them before publication. That's the only real key. Anyway, those are just some comments while you've been thinking.
Then you have the occasion for a new publication.
I have a story.
Yeah,
Very, I mean,
okay.
it's a very short
I
anecdote.
thought Jeff did that to block the story. But okay.
No, the story is very small. I remember being a graduate student in the ethnic and pluralism course, and I made some comment in class. There was some discussion in class. The class was in the morning. The whole day went by. I was in the subway going home, late in the afternoon, early evening. I ran into Jeff on the subway, just happened to run into him. And he's like, "Oh, Rupa." Now remember, this is just a graduate student in his class. "I was thinking about what you said in class, and here's what I think." And so he remembered what I said, and it was on his mind to the point where he wanted to talk to me about it again. Like, for a 24-year-old, that was really remarkable. Like, I thought he didn't even know my name. So, that's, I would say, a small story that really stuck with me.
Well, thank you so much again for a wonderful panel. We'll break now for a half an hour for coffee and refreshments. We'll reconvene sharply at 11 for Professor Richard Alba's keynote lecture, and then we'll hear from Jeff a little bit more, and then we'll have some lunch. So please enjoy your coffee break. Okay, welcome back. Just a quick public service note for those online. This is organized as a webinar, so in order for your question to be asked, you have to type it into the Q&A feature of Zoom. Putting your hand up, we don't see it, so, and you can't use your mic in a webinar. So just type your message up. There's a big screen, and I can read them right away, and we'll get as many questions from you online as time allows. So I'm really okay, no problem. Okay. Yeah, that would be bad. I'm really very happy to introduce our keynote lecturer today. Who's going to give a talk as part of our event for Jeff. Richard Alba's interest in ethnicity was sown during his childhood. He grew up in the Bronx in New York City in the 1940s and 50s. And as we heard earlier, those interests were nurtured intellectually at Columbia University, where he did his undergraduate training and then went on to do his graduate degrees, completing his PhD in 1974 in sociology. He was Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of Albany, at the City University of New York, until coming to the Graduate Center of CUNY in September 2008. He's also on the staff of the Graduate Center's Center for Urban Research. Is that still the case? Excellent. And was its acting director during the 2011-12 academic year. Professor Alba's teaching and research has been focused on immigration societies of North America and Western Europe. He's carried out research in France and Germany with the support of Fulbright grants and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the German Marshall Fund, and the Russell Sage Foundation. In 2003-2004, he was a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. His research has also received support from a number of institutions, including the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. His books are many and include Strangers No More, Immigration and the Challenges of Integration in North America and Western Europe, which he co-authored with Nancy Foner. The Next Generation, Immigrant Youth in a Comparative Perspective, co-edited with Mary Waters, thank you. Blurring the Color Line, The New Chance for a More Integrated America, and Remaking the American Mainstream, Assimilation and Contemporary Immigration, which he co-authored with Victor Nee. Richard is an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences. He's the former president of the Eastern Sociological Society and former Vice President of the American Sociological Association. And we're truly delighted that you're joining us today, Richard. Your talk will be roughly 45 to 50 minutes, at which time we'll open up for questions and conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, Phil, thank you so much for inviting me to this event. It's really a delight to be here to celebrate Jeff's very productive and influential career, and I think I'm all the more impressed after this morning's session on how admirable your career has been and how much it has involved not only collaboration but including younger people in your work. Jeff and I have actually known each other for a really long time. I met him when I was an undergraduate at Columbia before him, and I was a math student, as he was, although I didn't finish in math. After college, I kind of got lost a bit, and so I wound up as a programmer at the Bureau of Applied Social Research when Jeff was a graduate student studying with Paul Lazarsfeld. And I remember with great clarity one day when he came into my office. I must have been about 23, so that's almost 60 years ago. And he started describing some work he was doing and showing me some correlations. And correlations? What? Like what? I didn't know about correlations. And I said, well, how big are these correlations? And he said, oh, they're in the 0.3 range. Oh, they're kind of, moderately large. And, wow, I was just so impressed at this ability to discern, the kind of relative importance of this and that. And I thought, I want that kind of knowledge. Well, he didn't actually start me on the path to sociology, but it was another little impetus, that this was the direction in which I should head. And so as you heard, I went to Columbia also and was influenced by some of the same people, particularly Paul Lazarsfeld, that Jeff was. So with no further ado, after our conversation this morning, I'm beginning to think that I may be bringing a story to you that really is a south of the border story, and not so important in the Canadian scene. But in any event, I think it is an important story in American social science at this moment. So realism and social justice. And you notice that I'm assimilation/integration. I will talk mainly about assimilation, but partly inspired by Jeff's work with Raymond Breton, the illusion of difference. I know that on the ground, this is not so different from the way in which integration works in Canada. But what I think is different is this tension between realism, which is, I think, what Jeff and I both share from our Columbia training, and social justice as you'll see, as a rationale. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about Columbia, which is, so we were both there. This was an intellectual environment that was dominated by two really kind of luminary figures who, they were giants of their time, and they were a team. They very much worked hand in hand, and they created a kind of empirically oriented sociology that had what I'll call a scientific, in quotes, impetus. And so, Jeff was described this morning as being hostile to grand theory. So Merton wrote a very famous, and I think justly famous, essay on middle range theory, where he argued precisely that the way to make progress in the social sciences and in sociology was not through grand theory, but through kind of the sort of theoretically inspired empirical research. So theory leads to hypotheses, empirical hypotheses. You test those hypotheses against empirical reality, and you sort of assemble knowledge, and kind of from that you develop larger theoretical schemes that can encompass this empirically oriented sociology. Lazarsfeld, as probably you know, was a methodological pioneer. He developed many methods that were applicable particularly to survey research. The elaboration schema, which I mentioned here, was a really important early essay on how to think about the causal relationships among three variables, and it was influential for decades. So, to me, they were promulgating something that I'm going to call sociological realism, where the goal was to discover how social processes work, how society is structured in reality, and not to sort of devise very abstract approaches that kind of were overarching. And of course, at the same time, as there was sociological realism, there was critical sociology, which of course comes from a different source, namely the Frankfurt School. And it had a very different orientation. Rather than, in a sense, assembling knowledge about social reality, it was the aim of critiquing the way that society is organized and functions, and through critique, to spur social justice transformations. So one of the early figures in the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer, described theory as critical when its goal is, quote, to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. So there was critical sociology at Columbia, but it really, its leading figure, C. Wright Mills, was gone before Jeff and I were students. He died early in life in 1962. And there was this early tension between critical theory and the sort of realism that I'm sort of putting forward at Columbia. So the Bureau of Applied Social Research, which was Lazarsfeld's center, where both Jeff and I worked, was critiqued by critical sociologists for doing administrative research, quote unquote, which was seen as research in the service of people in power, authority. Well, increasingly in American sociology, social justice is seen as the rationale for the sociological enterprise and the rationale for judging sort of theoretical directions that will be fruitful versus those that will not be. So Prudence Carter, who was just ASA president, said in an interview as she was elected that these older theoretical frameworks developed primarily by white and European males came out of a particular kind of set of social circumstances, and those are the social circumstances that we want to leave behind, and therefore we should not pay so much attention to these theoretical ideas. I will say, though, that she also admitted later that sociology doesn't really know very much about how to spur social justice, which means maybe we shouldn't throw everything out. But social justice has become then a major rationale for judging the appropriateness of ideas. And this brings me to my attention. So, of course, you probably know that I'm a sociologist of assimilation. And so the question now is assimilation dead? Indeed, one hears often that assimilation is dead. No, assimilation theory is not useful. Actually, this is a point in the cycle that we've been through before. So the question, is assimilation dead, is the title of a fairly well-known Nathan Glaser essay from the early 1990s, which did sort of imply that assimilation might be on its way out. And today, I think, it's really been eclipsed in the sociology of ethnicity, race, and immigration by the ascent of critical race theory, the new centrality of Du Bois in sociology, and in general, the focus on the persistence of racism and on white supremacy. So, for example, in an essay in the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, its inaugural issue, Vilna Bashi-Treitler, at the time my colleague, rejects the assimilation model because she argues that it supports white supremacy and therefore does not deserve to occupy a central place in the sociology of race and ethnicity. So my talk is intended to be somewhat provocative, but the provocation may be falling in the wrong place because you may not sense this tension, which is very much in American sociology. But my argument's going to be that you can't just dispense with the knowledge acquired by realist sociology, that it's actually a very perilous course to reject ideas because they are seen as incompatible with social justice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is assimilation in my view, and then I'm going to give a lot of data, because of course, hey, I'm from Columbia too. Data's the game. And so, we'll talk about, is there really assimilation or not? Okay, so what is assimilation? So this is sort of straight out of Alba and Nee. So I see assimilation as it's a theory of social change. And it focuses on the social boundaries between groups, especially groups defined by immigration status, ethnicity, race. And it can be defined, assimilation that is, as the decline of a social distinction and the corollary social and cultural differences that go along with it. The way it's defined by us is agnostic about what the role of the two sides are. So we're not implying, we don't believe, that assimilation requires that the less powerful side kind of migrate to the more powerful side, absorbing its ideas, and trying to look more and more like the majority. So what is this, but operationally, what does this decline mean? So it means that the occurrences, the social occurrences for which a distinction is relevant decline, right? So more and more in everyday life, people interact without that distinction defining how they interact or overshadowing the aspects of their interaction. Of course, this also implies that life chances over time become more equal between at least some part of a minority group and the members of the majority group. I use minority and majority in the standard sociological sense of a power distinction. So the majority group, whatever its number, is the more powerful group. A minority group is less powerful. So assimilation, in our view, does not require the extinction of the identities or the cultures that are aligned with a social boundary, though of course this can happen, especially over a long period of time. And our book describes assimilation as not one group becoming like the other, but one group entering the mainstream of society, a group that has been excluded from the mainstream. Can you see? Oh, you can't see that. Okay, because I can't. In fact, I better put on my glasses because I can't even read what I wrote here. So think of the mainstream as, the major social institutions, but also, an assemblage of social milieu where the presence of the majority group is unquestioned or unproblematic. Over time, as people enter the mainstream, it's not just that they proceed through these institutions like the educational institutions, but they gradually enter these social milieus, and they also may come to feel comfortable there or at home there. So these could be work environments, they could be family environments, they could be neighborhoods. But in any event, this is a process that involves both some kind of parity of life chances then and some degree of social integration in these social milieus. So how do we know that we can think of this process in terms of a mainstream defined in that way? And I think that we know because of history, and that history is the prior history of the assimilation of the descendants of the Southern and European immigrants in the United States in the post-World War II era. Now, today, that assimilation, at least south of the border, is discussed in terms of race theory. And in particular, the whiteness historians such as David Roediger and Noel Ignatieff and others have had a major impact on the way people think about it. And their argument has been that what happened in the post-World War II period is that these groups became accepted as whites. And they had previously, their whiteness status previously had been challenged. Now, I think that's true, but I think it's also one-dimensional, and it loses sight of other social differences that were important that didn't disappear in the way that the racial distinction between these groups and the dominant Anglo-Protestant whites disappeared. So we know, or we should know in the US, that religion and ethnicity were also really important. The mainstream prior to 1950 was very clearly an Anglo-Protestant mainstream that favored, excluded Catholics and Jews pretty much. It favored people with ancestry from Northern Europe and especially from the British Isles. So what happened then in this critical period, it's really 45 to 70 is the critical period. Well, what happened is that the mainstream changed its definition and became not only Anglo-Protestant, but it became a Judeo-Protestant mainstream where Catholicism certainly and Judaism had a recognized place within the mainstream. And it wasn't the mainstream that defined away the ethnic identities of the individuals who were assimilating. Far from that, actually. Those identities became more acceptable in a modified form, more acceptable as a way of defining oneself within the mainstream. So talking about oneself as Irish or Italian or Jewish became very acceptable ways of identifying. It wasn't that, as in the early 20th century, one had to reject those hyphenated identities and become just an American. So I think, and you'd be better judges than I, but I think this kind of assimilation is really not so different from what Canadians see as integration into, I'm assuming, a Canadian mainstream. Okay, so another important point here, I think, is the importance of history. And so, and in a way, insisting on this importance also says we can't, just because we think that the white ethnics could assimilate because they were white, we cannot separate that history from what is going on today if we want to have a full understanding of the processes of change today. So, and looking at history also is very informative about how assimilation works on the ground, which is not necessarily how it works in terms of an ideal typical theory. There's a messiness to assimilation on the ground that when we think about it in the abstract doesn't sort of reveal itself to us. So for example, in this period of assimilation in after World War II, elites still employed various kinds of strategies to impede the progress of these assimilating groups. So you can think of the anti-communism crusade of the 1950s as one of those strategies, because who were the people who were the targets of the crusaders? Well, disproportionately they were Jews, because Jews were an important part of the Communist Party and also of the socialist left in the United States. And the movements to punish people who were seen as disloyal to the US because of their political beliefs targeted areas such as Hollywood, college teaching, where Jews were very important. So Jews suffered disproportionately from the penalties that were imposed during the 1950s, by the House Un-American Activities Committee, by the McCarthy crusade, et cetera. And you could say the same thing about organized crime and Italians, but why don't we leave that? And okay, so I think when we look at that history, now, to say that history is important does not mean that what is happening in the United States today is a mere replication of what happened in the post-World War II period. These are really different periods, but the processes have certain similarities that make sense sociologically. So I'm going to point to 3 dimensions, and then I'm going to give you some data about how those dimensions are unfolding today. So one dimension is the increasing status overlap between minorities and majorities. Often, not always, but often this is a matter of social mobility on the part of minority groups that are positioned lower in the society than the majority is. But it doesn't only have to do with that. And actually the post-World War II period and the period today share something interesting, which is that there are macro-level changes in the society that promote social mobility from below. So in the post-World War II period, it was the enormous prosperity and institutional change linked to that prosperity that created massive mobility. Think of it in terms of higher education. So between 1940 and 1970, the number of people in colleges and universities quintupled in the United States, went up by a factor of 5. And that was because of the paramount economic status of the United States in the world, the enormous prosperity of that period, and the investment, particularly in public higher education. Well, today, there's a similar kind of opening up that's promoted by demographic change, because the massive post-World War II baby boom, which is largely white, is retiring or disappearing from the labor market, from positions of leadership in civic organizations, and the cohorts that are maturing and entering the labor market are much more diverse, have fewer whites, and therefore it's simply impossible to maintain the level of sort of white concentration in positions of authority and in positions of prominence. And I'll show you data on that in a moment. So a second part of this is increasing social proximity. That means that people are coming more and more into contact outside of work, in work environments, but also outside of work environments, in neighborhoods and in families. Intermarriage is burgeoning. More and more young people are coming from mixed family backgrounds. And finally, I would say, there's the transformation of popular culture, which was very important in the post-World War II period. You may remember that, or maybe you don't remember, but you may, if you have any sense of that period in the U.S., the culture was dominated by the World War II experience, which emphasized actually the mixing of people of different European backgrounds in the combat units that fought the war. So there was a kind of melting pot in miniature quality to the war movies, to the war novels. And so it really redefined how these groups were seen with respect to American identity and culture. We think of increasing contact across ethnic lines or racial lines as important because of the contact hypothesis, but culture can generalize these perceptions that are more limited when they really arise only out of interpersonal contacts. Okay, so some data. So I mentioned, I said earlier that an important part of what's going on is what I call non-zero sum mobility. That is mobility that in some sense is required by changes that are taking place at the macro level of society. And today those are largely demographic. And so if we look at the top tier of the US workforce, the white predominance is rapidly declining. So if you look at the percentages, the bottom two lines, and you look at the older group in 2000, which is the number on the left, you see that the top quartile of the workforce was really dominated by whites in the oldest cohort in the 2000 census. So these are census data. So whites were 86% of the occupants of the best jobs in that period. And as we go from left to right and also from the top row to the bottom row, you can see the numbers are changing substantially with each new cohort, and also as you go from older to from an older time to a more recent time, to the point that among the youngest cohort in the 2015-2019 period, now whites are down to 62% of the occupants of the best jobs, of the top quartile of occupations. So that's actually close to what their population proportion is. So things have changed. Now, an argument that has been made against this sort of presentation is that minorities are still not able to get into the very top positions. So a colleague wrote a book called Stuck, which is about Asian Americans, and claimed that Asian Americans are unable or sort of have great difficulty in making it through a so-called bamboo ceiling into the C-suite, the top jobs in companies. Well, maybe not. So if we look at the corporate elite today, I think there really is a change, what we could call a transformation underway. And I think it's all the more impressive because it's not just quantitative data, but it's also qualitative data where individuals are examined in terms of their origins, show that there is much more ethno-racial diversity at the top of American corporations today than there was only a short time ago. And so the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission collects annual data from companies that have at least 100 employees, and it requires them to describe the ethno-racial origins of people at various tiers of an organization. And so one tier, for which we have data starting in 2007, is the so-called C-suite, people who have titles like Chief Executive Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Data Officer, and so forth. And you can see that early in this period, 2007 to 2012, the white occupation of those jobs was very high, close to 90%. But starting around 2012, sort of the end of the Great Recession, things start to change, and the white percentage goes down. I don't mean to imply that we're at parity, but it is really changing. And it's interesting to look at how these changes are occurring. So here's a quantitative listing of people in the C-suite 10 years apart. And The best way of looking at this is in terms of the percentages of occupants, but also in terms of the increase. So notice whites are not losing in terms of their percentage. In fact, the number of whites has gone up very slightly by 8% between 2011 and 2021. But the numbers of other groups are going up much more than is the number of whites. So African Americans, Hispanic Americans increase by 50% in C-suite occupancy, but between the two dates. The Asian number, I'm sorry, it's not the Asian percentage, the Asian number doubles in that 10-year period. The number of people of mixed background goes up by threefold in that 10-year period. So whites are still important, but they are no longer important alone, and more diversity is present in these top positions. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I'm speaking longer than I thought, I'll just say residential increasing, despite everything you hear, is actually increasing. And we know that because we can look at the kind of census tract in which the average white lives. And so once in 1990, the average white lived in a census tract that was overwhelmingly white, 85% white. And now the average white lives in a census tract that's 69% white, which is really a very big difference. It means that there are many whites living in, since that's an average, there are many whites living in communities where whites are not the majority any longer. So we have, so there's more and more residential contact between whites and others, even though it's also true that there remain ghettos, or at least enclaves, where minority groups are in the majority. There's more and more mixing in families, and I think, and to my mind, one of its consequences has a really profound portent for the future of American society. So there is a growing number of Americans who come from ethno-racially mixed families, and particularly important here is the majority, which comes from families that mix whites and minorities. So about 15% of births are to parents who belong to two different major ethno-racial groups, and about 3/4 of those births involve a white parent and a non-white parent. This has been ratcheting up over time, not increasing dramatically from any one year to the next, but increasing every year a little bit more. So we don't know where this will end, but I think it's clear that mixed Americans among youth are a very important part of the youth population, on a par with actually the children of minority parents, from any particular group. So if we looked at African Americans, they would be about the same size. If we looked at Asian Americans, they would be fewer in number than the mixed population. So when we look at the sociological characteristics of young mixed Americans, we see that they are really a distinctive population. They are not being incorporated necessarily into either the minority side or the majority side. And they have a their sociological situation is very significant because the children in mixed families are growing up by definition with parents and kin who belong to two different major groups, and they are being therefore exposed to others from two different major ethno-racial groups to the cultures of two different major ethno-racial groups. When they are partly white, they're being exposed to the dominant group networks, and the dominant group culture. In the 20th century, the so-called one-drop rule was often seen as kind of reigning over the situation of mixed individuals who are particularly mixed white and black. I would say that's not really true anymore. I mean, I think all the research shows that that isn't true, that these are people who really are, in some sense, in between. So certainly mixed white minority individuals have advantages that are not shared by their minority-only peers. It's partly because they are partly white. It's also because the minority individuals who marry whites are selective in certain important respects. These individuals are socially integrated, in part with whites, as evidenced by their very high rates of marriage to whites. Their identities, often reflect a lot of reflect aspects of their minority heritage. And we know from some research that they are unusually fluid, that they don't report the same way consistently on the US Census, for example. So again, this shows that they have an in-between status. Okay, so this is just an example to show the advantages of mixed individuals in a particular case, Latinos and education. So there are, if we compare whites and Latino-only individuals, there are still big differences in educational attainment, though they are shrinking slightly. Look at the top panel, shows you for men in 2000, these are people in their mid-20s, so it assumes that they finished college on time. You can see that the BA degree and postgrad are only about 10% of the young male Latinos, whereas among whites, nearly 30% have a BA or more. Now, granted, there are important changes over time. So if we look at mixed Hispanics male again, so in the later period, which is only 15 to 20 years later, the percentage jumps up to 15%, in other words, a 50% increase from what it had been in 2000. But then look at the next line down. So these are the young people who come from mixed Hispanic, non-Hispanic white backgrounds, and their percentage with a BA or better it isn't equal to the white percentage, but it's pretty close to the white percentage. They're much closer to whites than they are to Hispanics. Then finally, I think one should point to the ongoing transformation of popular culture, which I wrote about in an article that just appeared in GEMS. And again, we have really good quantitative data about this because a sociologist at UCLA, Darnell Hunt, and his colleagues have been collecting data about the people in film and in television, not only before the camera, but also behind the camera for at least 10 years. And when we look at those 10 years and the changes that have taken place, I think it's fair to call them remarkable. So in Hollywood especially, they're remarkable. So in terms of actors of color, over 10 years, their percent has quadrupled, and they've reached a level of representation in major roles as well as in minor roles that is approximately equal to their percent of the population. They're not quite at this point of parity when it comes to people who direct and who write films, but again, their percentages have increased very sharply. One could even say dramatically over a 10-year period. The story isn't quite so strong in television, but it is very strong. Of course, television, unlike film, has multi-year shows, so in which often the cast, the creators remain the same, so that slows this process of change. But clearly, there's a very big change taking place. And whites, we know from this research, they have audience research, whites are watching increasingly diverse programming reflecting the changes that are taking place. And I think culture is very relevant because in some of the areas that I spoke of, and I didn't really go into this in detail, the groups of color with an immigration background, like Asians and Latinos, are doing better, it would seem, than African Americans. But when it comes to culture, African Americans are really in the vanguard of these changes, and not just because they are more frequent actors, but also because they're more frequent creators. Like, there are a series of prominent African American directors now in film, like Ava DuVernay, and they're making films that deal with their experiences and their group's experiences, not just films that reflect kind of white preoccupations. Okay, so let me end up here. I guess I'm talking longer than 45 minutes. Is that okay, Phil? Yeah, all right. So, because I think the next example is important. So, one of the sort of tropes in contemporary American sociology is that non-whites are never treated the same as whites. And I think it's important to point out at least one example where that does not seem to be true, and to try to draw some conclusions from that example. And the example is Hawaii. So Hawaii is a state in the U.S., obviously, an archipelago that became part of the United States through processes of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. So whites began arriving in the archipelago in the very late 18th, early 19th centuries. Maybe the most important arrivals were those of the Anglo-American missionaries, mainly coming from New England, Protestant missionaries. They came in the 1820s, and they established families that gradually became dynasties, really, within Hawaiian society. Anyway, their arrival, just as with indigenous Americans, ignited a process of demographic decline in the native population, largely through exposure to diseases to which the native population had no immunity. Whites, of course, Hawaii was an independent nation until the very late 19th century. But whites began in the middle of that century to pressure the king and the government to grant them the right to buy property. And in fact, Hawaii changed its land laws in the middle of the century, and this gave rise to a transformation of ownership, which went from indigenous hands to more and more to white hands. That allowed whites to establish essentially a plantation economy based on sugar and partly more on sugar than anything, but also partly on cattle. As Native Hawaiians were declining and were not suitable workers for the plantations, so whites imported Asian immigrants, first from China, then from Japan and the Philippines. So there was a very large Asian immigrant population that was working as sort of the lowest level of work on the plantations. Then at the end of the 19th century, whites arranged first the overthrow of the monarchy, and then the transfer of Hawaii from the status of an independent nation to that of a territory of the United States in 1898. So in the first part of the 20th century, this was a plantation society. You know, the plantations were the dominant economic forces. They were organized according to a very strict racial hierarchy with white owners and maybe overseers at the top, and immigrant workers largely from Asia, but also Portugal at the bottom, and then a kind of a middle tier of field supervisors who would oversee the workers. World War II came. The Japanese were by then the largest group in Hawaii. And of course, they came under deep suspicion at the outset of the war, which of course commenced with an attack on Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. They could not be interned because they were too big. And also their labor was too important to the Hawaiian economy. So after the war, some of the same institutional and economic changes that took place on the mainland and that led to the assimilation of the white ethnics took place on Hawaii. And one of them was the expansion of higher education, which I referred to earlier. However, on Hawaii, there were no white ethnics to take advantage of this opening up of opportunity. So the groups that could take advantage were Asian immigrant groups, and in particular, the Japanese and the Chinese. They were the dominant students at the University of Hawaii, which was expanding in the post-World War II period. So they quickly caught up to whites in terms first of education, but then in terms of occupational placement. A measure of that, as I say, is here is their representation among professionals. So by 1980, roughly, they had caught up to whites in terms of percentages in professional occupations. Interracial marriage, which was also always a kind of an undercurrent in Hawaii. It was often marriage between Native Hawaiians and these newer groups. Interracial marriage began to climb. The Japanese had been the most endogamous, but after the war, their intermarriage rates climbed, and they began to outmarry at relatively high rates. So today, multiraciality, which I was referring to as an important phenomenon in the United States, is at an extreme level for the United States in Hawaii. According to our analysis of census data, a quarter of Hawaiian residents have ancestry from two or more of the major racial groups. Among children, it's almost 40%. These are numbers that are way beyond what we observe in the United States. So what happened in Hawaii was really then white supremacy no longer was the potent way the dominant factor, but really it was a multiracial mainstream, but it wasn't one of equal opportunity. It was one in which whites, Japanese, and to a lesser extent, Chinese were the important groups. So it's still, and I think this is an important lesson about the changes that may be coming ahead. There's still important ethno-racial inequality in Hawaii, especially poorly placed are the indigenous group of Native Hawaiians who have much less education and occupational placement than do the whites, Japanese, and Chinese. So, what can we conclude? Well, I think, and this is really important for me at least, the United States has really sort of two different modalities at least. So on the one hand, assimilation is still an important pattern. It's not an all-encompassing pattern, but it's a pattern that is not only changing the opportunities for some groups, but it's also changing the society itself, because it's changing the mainstream, as evidenced, for example, by the changes in popular culture. But it's also a society where institutional and interpersonal racism remain important. So I think, we have to think about these as two different sets of social processes. On the one hand, there is assimilation. On the other hand, there certainly is racialization. These can coexist. One does not necessarily negate the other. I think, and I didn't bring this out as clearly, but I think that the assimilation pattern better fits the experiences of immigrant origin groups than it does groups that entered the United States through enslavement or conquest. And that's important because the way American sociology now is approaching these topics is heavily race-focused. And so, therefore, if people are non-white, this is a shared racial distinction from the dominant white group. That means that they have something very important in common. But many of those non-white groups are also are immigrant groups. And I argue that that's as important as race in shaping their experiences, their worldviews, their sense of affiliation. And, it's important to recognize that racism is not the only force, but that assimilation is also present and changing the society. The assimilation today is much more selective than the assimilation of the mid-20th century, which was truly massive. And I think that's because, in part, the dynamics of mobility, the non-zero-sum mobility of the earlier period was so much more massive than is the demographically driven non-zero-sum mobility today. Assimilation is certainly consistent with a high level of overall inequality. Assimilation doesn't really change the level of economic inequality. It changes the sorting of people among their places in economic structures. And of course, we still see major inequalities between major ethno-racial categories, but it's important to pay attention to the growing heterogeneity within those categories. For example, among Hispanics. So those Hispanics who are part Hispanic and part white are in a very different situation in American society from those Hispanics who are only Hispanic. So it's important not to forget assimilation because of the way it is changing the nature of the mainstream and affecting the potential for larger social change. So, and I think we can see the hand of assimilation in the changing political alignments of American society. There's been a considerable surprise expressed about the growing percentage of minorities, Hispanics, Asians, and even African Americans who seem willing to vote for Donald Trump. And I think that given the assimilation that is ongoing, that shouldn't be such a surprise. So political assimilation means that people who are not white begin to vote more like whites, that working class Hispanics, like working class whites, now find that that Trump has a real appeal for them. So, so assimilation is changing the social landscape in ways that we don't fully understand, but we can't ignore the ways that it's changing the landscape. So you could say that realist sociology devoid of concerns for social justice is sterile, and I think that's true. But critical sociology, without a strong dose of realistic knowledge about the society, amounts to tilting against windmills. So we need both, and I'll end there. Sorry, it took an hour, my goodness. Well, good. Sure, thank you.
So, same process as before. If you have a question, please put up your hand, and then one of our great staff will come around with the microphone, and please use the microphone.
Thank you for that. That was fascinating. I wanted to get your reaction to the current backlash at perhaps some of the policies that have led to the progress that we're actually seeing in the data on the C-suites, for example. So equity, diversity, inclusion types of policies. So-
Could you be more specific about what you see as the backlash?
Sorry, I'll say it again. So I was asking for a comment on the current backlash on many of the policies that have led to some of the progress that we're seeing here in the charts. So backlash against equity, diversity, inclusion policies, for example.
Well, I mean, we are a very polarized society. I think that there may be, and it should be pointed out, backlash doesn't mean successful backlash. And I think that there's backlash, but there's also very strong impetus coming especially from younger people. I mean, that was partly the background to my question about the demonstrations on behalf of Palestinians. So I think don't underestimate the political force for social justice. I think this moment in American society is a moment like the late 1960s. And it is when, of course, and they shared the same quality of identification with a much less powerful outsider group. So in the 1960s, it was the Vietnamese and African Americans domestically. Today, it is the people in Gaza, but there's also the same impetus to transform American society. Now, that impetus will not be fully successful, but it will continue to force some of the changes that I pointed out here, sort of the opening up of more powerful positions in the American economy, in the American polity, to people coming from the outside. I think also that, part of what motivates my work and my emphasis on young people growing up in ethno-racially mixed families is a sense that America needs, at least in this respect, a more optimistic sense of what the future is bringing about. And I think that the way that the future has been defined for them, partly by social scientists actually, is very counterproductive. It's in terms of a binary. Whites are declining. Whites are going to be a minority. People of color will be the majority. Well, this vision, and I could go on and on into details about this, completely overlooks how important demographically the young people of mixed background are going to turn out to be. And I might point out that they are, and I'm actually writing about this at the moment, they are dramatically underestimated in census data and census projection, dramatically. And moreover, the census says they're not white. Well, wait a second. These are mostly people who have a white parent. They're an in-between group. And their growing size and their growing importance means that this binary way of thinking about the future is not accurate. And it isn't fruitful in the sense that we know, the social psychological research shows that it promotes pessimism and conservatism among whites, and that whites are capable of responding in a more positive way to a vision of the future that says, well, we're blending. Just as we did before, we're blending. So, yes.
Fascinating. My comment, query, question is how it's going to affect the American political infrastructure. Because politics is all about power, acquisition and maintenance. And you look at the two principal
Yes.
parties in the States. I would suspect that there are several people in each of the parties that are pondering what you're advancing at this particular moment. And they're saying, how can we use this to our advantage without going into politics of carnage?
Well, I mean, in a way, what I just said is part of maybe the strongest part of any answer I would give, and that is that we should use this to articulate a different image of the potential American future, one that is more engaging for all parts of the American population, including whites. I think that the Democratic Party early in the 20th century went astray because it believed these foolish demographic projections, which said that there's going to be a permanent demographic majority because of the growth of minority populations. And that was foolish because it assumed, in a sense, no assimilation. It assumed that people who were not white were going to continue to vote heavily for the Democratic Party. And while they still vote in the main for the Democratic Party, it's less heavily than before. And I think also that the emphasis on minorities lost working class whites for the Democratic Party. And that's a huge mistake because whites are still not only the majority of the country, they are the big majority of the electorate. And so, I think the Democratic Party needs to re-engage with working class whites. And Biden has tried this, but I'm not sure he's been very successful. I mean, he's very, he's certainly been interested in bringing back jobs that working class people could do. He's been interested in unions and promoting unionization, which is certainly a good thing. But I think Democrats need to do more of that than they have been doing. It's baffling in a way that so many people are attracted by Trump. I have trouble understanding it myself. But I think a lot of whites feel left behind in American society is what it comes down to. Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I guess I wanted to hear, this is just my own thinking, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. Like the social markers of difference that have occupied a lot of the assimilation theories around racialization and where legal relationship with the state would fall in. So we have increasing numbers in Canada and the US of people who aren't citizens, aren't permanent residents, and that is not typically considered a racialized identity, but I do think it is very much an othering process. And it makes me think about the groups that are deemed unassimilable. How do you say that word?
Unassimilable, that's
I can't
right,
say the word, okay. And I'm thinking of Sarah Ahmed's ideas about the other who can be assimilated, which I think I would fall into that category. My parents who immigrated in the 70s in like a 99.9% white region. And certainly their entire project of raising us was to assimilate us. Okay, so I've successfully assimilated. I still feel it on a daily basis, by the way. You notice every day when you're not doing the thing. So the other that can be assimilated, I think, is somewhere in where your study is. So I'm asking you maybe to think about, or ask us to think about those who are deemed as the other, who are incarcerated, who are deported, who are deemed or dehumanized because of their legal status. And certainly the census data is not capturing this, but I certainly worry about how much of the fragmentation of society, they're not going to be able to vote is obscured by thinking about race because immigration status as a proxy of other, but not, I don't know, I'm curious, like how do we think about assimilation
Yeah,
when the entire state project is
Yeah.
excluding folks?
Well,
Thanks.
I mean, I certainly, there are many people in American society who don't have even the legal right to reside in American society, as you know. And those numbers, I guess, are increasing given the flow of people across the southern border. I think it's really important in the United States to maintain what lawyers call jus solis, which means that birth in the United States guarantees citizenship. As you probably know, Trump would like to change that. And I think that would really be, for the U.S., a disaster to create a permanent class that never, intergenerationally even, could attain legal status. I think, I don't think assimilation is all-encompassing. I don't think it includes everybody. I think it is a movement of inclusion, though, and it is changing the society in ways that make it somewhat better. That's the best answer I can give. I'm not going to deny that there are enormous inequalities and that they have to do with origin and in part with race. I accept, by the way, your word of othering. I would object to the word racialization applied to people who were not citizens. I think we should be clear in our concepts. And even if there are physical distinguishing differences between those two groups, it's still the case that the children of those racialized individuals have a status that their parents could not have in the U.S.
Yeah, thanks. And by the way, thank you for your endorsement of the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship, which I think is really important to maintain in the U.S.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, and I think this is a fascinating talk, but I'm wondering if you have a sense of what's sort of the geographic distribution of the changes you're finding, because one thing, and this relates to the question about backlash earlier, I'm looking at this data, and what I'm in part thinking is, in a way, the changes you're describing, not just in popular culture, but also in intermixing, are the kinds of things that, in particular, rural, older, white Americans may be looking at and panicking about, in the sense of losing dominance, in moving in. This is all over white Christian nationalism, right? Fears of, quote, great replacement theory, unquote, all those things. And I'm just wondering if are a lot of these changes things happening in blue states or in urban areas and so forth?
I think they're happening in
broader
big metropolitan areas. Yes, you're right. And they're happening in metropolitan areas that are very diverse because of immigration. They're not necessarily in blue states. I'm sure we would find them in Atlanta if we went there. But I think that you're right that geography is very important. And I think that the backlash indeed has its political base in whites living away from these, cosmopolitan, diverse areas. Many of them who see their, not just, well, it's not a matter of their own lives necessarily, it's a matter of their communities. They see their communities as really lagging behind. Now, just sort of a bit of personal experience. So I live in more than two places, but I live primarily in two places. One is New York City, but I also live upstate New York. And I live upstate New York in a very red district. And it's heavily white, very heavily economically, marginal, and demographically stagnant, if not collapsing. So I think the people who live in such places, which are in the South, in the Midwest especially, they have a sense of decline about them. And they feel left behind. They may be individually prosperous. I don't think that's what matters. What matters is kind of how they see their future based upon the experiences in their community. In these communities, any young person who's at all ambitious leaves because there's nothing. There's really no real opportunity to get ahead. And so that's that kind of geographic split between the economically dynamic large metropolitan regions, which are also, of course, the places where immigrants go, and therefore they're very diverse, and these wider, often more rural, but not exclusively rural places. That's very much at the heart of the polarization in American society. Yeah. Yeah. And there's no easy answer.
Thank you, Richard, for a very provocative lecture. There's so many thoughts just percolating in my head as a historian of the United States, as somebody who lived in the States for 7 years, and who often reflects on some of these issues, albeit with a historical lens. So the gentleman behind me invoked the 14th Amendment, which is important and pertinent as we think about citizenship, assimilation, et cetera. I would be remiss if I didn't point this out, and I presume some others here know that the 14th Amendment, when Congress approbated it, it includes a caveat, of course. And the caveat, because the 14th Amendment was created to incorporate formerly enslaved Africans, right? But the caveat, of course, is that when one is found guilty of having committed a crime, one is incarcerated, they're no longer a citizen. They've lost that citizenship status, right? That legal status to be a human being within the United States, and that they can be therefore rendered mere property, chattel, an enslaved person again. And so, of course, we see during Reconstruction and its aftermath, and then certainly it picks up again after World War II in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, mostly as a response or quote-unquote backlash against black militancy, sort of the rise of mass incarceration, and a very draconian sort of top-down heavy measure to rid American cities, and it's very gendered as well, rid American cities of boys and young men who are warehoused. I mean, certainly upstate New York has an industry, sort of an entire economy based on warehousing black boys and young men. And so within the context of assimilation, how do we reconcile the idea, and I'll say something that might be polemical to some ears, that the quote-unquote American Negro or black people, African Americans, are beyond the threshold of people who could be incorporated in the United States, that they could be assimilated, or they have a genuine right to assimilate in terms of social mobility, in terms of protections from the state against state violence and paramilitary and other vigilante violence. Is this something that you see in terms of your research? And then sort of secondly, when we look at other groups of Americans in the United States, and historically there have been rabid forms of racism, whether it's Italians, Jewish immigrants from different parts of Europe, certainly Mexican immigrants, Asian Americans, virulent racism, right? And sometimes lynching, which was almost exclusively reserved for black people, was applied to them. But over the passage of time, and certainly after World War II, there was greater capacity for the structures of white power to incorporate the various groups, and you alluded to this, the various groups that had before been excluded and been marginalized. But so within the context of assimilationist theory in the United States, does, again, the African-American presence, which has created this binary, and you spoke about sort of those who were incorporated via conquest, indigenous peoples, those who were incorporated or at least ended up in the United States via transatlantic slavery. Does the presence of black people in the United States make it possible for other Americans, whether immigrants from Europe, West Asia, et cetera, to be assimilated?
Well, this is, of course, a big question. And I don't think I have a great answer. First of all, to go back to your, you started with incarceration. Assimilation theory can't encompass everything. It just can't. And, this is a society with different sets of processes operating. I mean, racism is over here, assimilation is over here. One does not negate the other. But I do think this. I think that I think it's much easier for the children of immigrants to assimilate than it is for the children of African Americans. But I think that African Americans are included in these changes to a degree that they have never been. Now, does that mean that they are fully equal? No. I mean, of course, racism is terribly important, but we've had a black president. I don't know if you're aware of it. It's something that isn't really recognized, but the percentage of black representatives in the U.S. House is equal to the percent of blacks in the American population. I mean, maybe that was true during Reconstruction. I don't know, but it's certainly not been true since Reconstruction. So, I mean, I see a lot of evidence of kind of growing integration of African Americans into mainstream institutions and settings, but I agree that there's still a basic unfairness in that there are many African Americans who are left behind. I can't resolve that, but I still say that assimilation is changing the society in ways that we have to respect, that we have to understand, that we can't simply say, we rule this out because it really supports white supremacy. Yeah, all right.
Very quick follow-up question. So I agree, yes. We've seen nominal assimilation where elite African Americans are concerned, and I think it's important to have sort of a class analysis.
I don't think it's just elite. I mean, it's middle-class African Americans are better integrated.
Sure. But certainly African Americans of elite background have enjoyed greater fruits of sort of the empire. So yes, we've had a black president and a black first family, a black first lady. The current Secretary of Defense, who is the face of the empire, is African American.
Yes.
There are African American luminaries, et cetera, across the country. And certainly when you go to places like Columbia and other elite universities, the black students that you meet, sometimes they share commonalities with me in that they're children of immigrants and coming from Africa or the Caribbean. But it sort of obfuscates the narrative. And so you see all these black students at Harvard and Penn and Princeton and Columbia. In reality, oftentimes they have very little connection in terms of sort of the generations and the compounded effects of Jim Crow in the United States.
I can believe that. Yeah.
Right, so they're first generation immigrant children, et cetera, usually from very elite backgrounds. And so when we look at, again, sort of the model of incorporation or assimilation, the narrative that sometimes these elite institutions, propagate can be very misleading. And so, again, seldom do I go to, whether it's like the New York Times or any sort of liberal institution, I'm meeting children who will tell me, my parents are from the Mississippi Delta, or from, Georgia and other parts, or Watts and other parts of the country where, they're suffering from generations of inequality, post-industrialism, et cetera. And so maybe if you could speak to sort of how this image of assimilation is complicated.
I really think, forgive me that I'm going to say this, okay? And because I'm sure you know the African American communities better than I do. You know them in depths that I don't. But looking into the data, and actually looking even at some of the people who are rising to professorships, I think it's not as extreme as you're saying. I'm not saying it's equal and fair, but it's not as extreme. Certainly in sociology, Alden Morris, president of the ASA, grew up in Mississippi. Prudence Carter, president of the ASA, grew up in Mississippi. So I think that, you know, I think there's not enough change, but there's more change than maybe you're acknowledging.
Yes. So are we cherry picking then? Is this sort of a creaming effect?
I don't know. I really don't know. Yeah.
Also a topic.
I have a quick question, and it kind of speaks to a bit of the debate and tension that's going on within the conversation, is can we understand processes of racialization and processes of assimilation as separate?
And can we understand them
as separate?
as separate? Well, I think that we need to. Yeah. That, you know, that's, so this,
But doesn't
if we
also assimilation?
if we confound them, then we don't go anywhere. Because it's always, I mean, in the United States, you can always object that there is racism. There is racism, no question. But if then that appears to cancel out assimilation, I'm trying to say that's a big mistake, because we need to understand how a society is changing and what the full implications of those changes are, even how we can accelerate those changes. And American society is changing.
I have time for one more question.
Yes, hi.
I'll try a follow-up too, but just briefly in following on this conversation, one of the arguments among historians certainly on in relation to assimilation, and this is in the 1990s in whiteness studies, whatever one thinks of them, is that in fact there was a sense that assimilation could function where being not black was an important driver of assimilation or a guide for it.
Yeah,
I guess my question would be, to what degree can you, if you look at all this data, can you see any of that pattern, I guess, reasserting itself in the sense of which groups assimilate or allow
Well,
to?
okay,
More,
so
you know,
one
if
thing
you
that we
follow
need
what I
to
mean.
know much better than we do, and Wendell might know this in depth better than any of us, is how the children of African immigrants are doing. And so, you know, so they share the same racial status. In fact, they, you know, relatively few of them have any white ancestry, whereas many African Americans have some white ancestry. But they are immigrants. And there are, and I've argued, there are advantages to being an immigrant in the United States. Advantages compared to other people of color who came into the United States, who have a longer history in the United States and a much deeper history of oppression in the United States. And I don't think we know enough yet. I mean, we have some optimistic pictures. I don't particularly think that they're fully convincing. We need to know that experience in much greater depth.
Okay. With that, thank you so much, Richard, for
Yeah.
a really stimulating talk.
Well, I guess I was provocative after all.
So we have one final speaker, and that's the person that we're here to celebrate. Jeff, if you give us some of your talk.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to continue talking about Richard's topic, but so I have comments on that, and I'm going to also make a couple of announcements before we have lunch, but I'm going to try to be quick. I certainly want to begin by thanking again Phil for arranging this event, the particular format that was selected to bring people who have been very significant to me as students and people like Richard to here for this event. Has been very emotional and gratifying experience, and so I can't thank you enough. It's really a kind gesture that unprovoked. Did it on your own, and it's really nice. And I would like to also thank again the speakers this morning, Rupa, Emily, and Wendell, for the kind things they said. While they were speaking, I was thinking of my partner here, Donna Gray. Marvelously engaging person, and has been my life partner for 35 years. I'm sure she's listening to this and thinking, who the hell are they talking about? That can't be. And I would just like to say that, and what she says is, of course, I can't know anything about that. I haven't read a word you've ever written. And but what she has done, so many things for me, most important person in every feature of my life, including the academic, because there isn't a word that I've written that I haven't discussed with her prior. And, always learn from that, and that goes on for 35 years. It's a big impact. And so I want to thank Donna for that very publicly. And I also would like to mention that there are other students that are here, our former students, that I would like to mention that I've collaborated with and with whom I had some experiences as we've been discussing. One of them is Kara Somerville who came in from Saskatchewan. I can't say she just flew in for this, but it's very nice. And, farther away, a research assistant, which I had in Paris, was Alexandra Kassir. We wrote a nice paper together, and she's Lebanese, and her Arabic helped out a lot in the interviewing. She's assistant professor of sociology at the American University in Beirut. There's Melissa Hassel, a research assistant I had in Mexico City, who was an undergraduate then, is now a graduate student in sociology, doctoral student at Harvard, being supervised by Mary Waters. And I think she may be here. I noticed my very first PhD student over here, Donna Dasko. I should say Senator Donna Dasko, who is a very well-known survey research pollster in Canada for many years. And so thank you for coming, Donna. And other people who are here. I feel like, my life has flashed before me. And you know what happens then. And so you feel this urgency to, say things to people because you don't want to end up, not having said the right things. So I will try to, Mort Weidfeld is here, a person that I've known from the beginning of my time in Canada, doing race relations research, and all those other people. And so I hope to connect with you during lunch or at some point in the near future. So I had, these three speakers this morning pulled a fast one on me because I thought they were going to present their research, and then I would, comment, and then maybe comment on, how it related to what we did together and so on, and they didn't do that at all. So I can go through, forget some of the things that I had been planning to say. I did think that Wendell probably underestimated the difference. I mean, he mentioned that he didn't get into the history department here, despite his straight A average, and that he went to the U.S. and so on. What he didn't say was that the U.S. place that he went was Yale University, an acceptable alternative maybe to U of T. And secondly, that dissertation that he was planning to write here and is considered uninteresting, which is to compare race relations in Canada and the U.S., became a dissertation at Yale, which won 4 awards at Yale. Canadian Studies, American History Award, African American History Award, and then did they make up the other one? Leadership Award. And as was mentioned, he's now winning awards at McGill because McGill got wind of all that. Wendell has told me at one point, relevant to the Canada-U.S. difference, that one of the interesting things about being in the U.S. as a black person is, different from Canada, is that there's a recognition that the disadvantage of blacks is distinctive. Whereas we have this idea of visible minorities, which sort of lumps all non-whites into one category, and it treats them as if their experiences are roughly the same. And the word racialization does the same thing. It sort of implies that all the racialized groups have the same experience. And one of the most fundamental errors there is the lack of recognition of black disadvantage and experience as distinctive, similar in a way to the distinctive disadvantage of Aboriginal peoples in Canada and the US. We have this goofy word BIPOC that's now beginning to emphasize that, the black and Aboriginal people and so on, as other people of color. So now the others, other people. But Canadian public policy has just begun to recognize a distinctive disadvantage of blacks in a number of ways. So I think that's an important feature, but it is a part of the discourse and not necessarily, a difference in reality. Now, so I want to turn to Richard. Richard mentioned that we were both at Columbia in the 60s and that we had shared views on social science, and the kinds of things that he was just talking about are views that I hold myself, deriving from our experiences at Columbia, including with Paul Lazarsfeld. We also share views on the current protest crisis there, and we've, deja vu all over again for us, and pity President Shafiq. She's probably done, and, for the same reasons that Grayson Kirk was done when, back in the 60s. And he also mentioned neither of us were studying ethnicity. I focused on that topic only after coming to Canada, and I never took a course on ethnicity in my life. And by the time, I became interested here. By the time I learned of Richard's work, he was already setting the agenda for research on ethnicity in the US and elsewhere. But he mentioned Lazarsfeld, and I think that we certainly have an abiding respect for, in particular for Lazarsfeld. And as a pragmatist myself, I was very fortunate to work with Lazarsfeld on a project, a book on the social science utilization, using social science in policy as both a social process and an intellectual process. And it was a qualitative case studies. We did case studies. In fact, I don't even know the number of case studies that that there was. There may have been hundreds, but Lazarsfeld was so good at extracting the lessons from social data. Stories or a number didn't matter. It was just that there was data, and our job is to interpret it. And as we were talking about earlier, the data can be one way or the other way, and it could be equally interesting. So I'd like to argue, basically, about the point I want to make today is that Richard's views on assimilation, his justifiably famous work, which has reinvigorated the discussion of assimilation in the U.S., is not only relevant for Canada, but the relevance is actually increasing. So when you boil it down, I would say that what Richard says is that if you define minority assimilation in a common sense way as the reduction of ethnic difference, then the evidence is clear. Assimilation happens quickly for many immigrant groups. It's almost, for European groups, almost complete by the second generation. And other groups assimilate to maybe a lesser degree, partly because of racial issues. It's slower, but it does happen. And we don't know the end point of that. And this has enormous practical implications. We don't need policies, for example, to assure immigrant assimilation in general. The immigrants do it on their own. They'll become good Americans. As Richard mentioned, they may even vote Republican which could be, unfortunately, I have to accept that you can be a good American and vote Republican. I'm not endorsing it. I'm just saying it's data. It's data. And his recent book on the demographic illusion makes this point again, emphasizing the mixed race persons as he has done. So the public implication is that widespread concerns about the decline of the white majority should be tempered by the knowledge that many minorities come to identify with that white majority. In Canada, the discussion of assimilation has been a harder sell. Now, it's partly the word. I view this as a discourse issue. As multiculturalism in Canada symbolizes Canadian distinctiveness. It's part of our national identity. And the word assimilation reminds people of the U.S. And that and then the assumption is, you use that word, there's a preference that ethnic groups should disappear or be made to disappear, maybe. And it turns out that, back to the basics, if you define and measure the concept, you find it's happening in Canada, probably to the same extent as in the U.S. My first ethnicity book was A Survival of Ethnic Groups, made this point about Canada, and I used the term integration, which emphasizes different. It emphasizes those aspects of assimilation that concern equality of relations within the mainstream society, and leaves aside the question of the retention of ethnic cultures. But nevertheless, the two may go hand in hand and usually do. And my later book with Ray Breton, as you've cited very kindly, showed that the data show that this happens more or less to the same degree. I'd like to mention that Ray was the guy, Raymond Breton was the person who was my teacher of ethnicity in Canada. And I learned from him by collaborating. He welcomed me as a collaborator, and we never looked back. We collaborated a number of times. Virtually anything I know about ethnicity really boils down to things that I learned from Professor Breton. And he knows I will be forever grateful to that. I see him frequently. I wanted to emphasize also another similarity between the work that I do and Richard, and that's the comparative dimension, which I think also reflects this, the view of social science as, focusing on what's, as you call it, realistic sociology. I sort of call it pragmatic sociology, but just sort of back to basics, concepts, data, conclusion, and, draw your political conclusions after that. And of course, your political viewpoints will affect the concepts that you adopt in the data, but it's all out there on the table for people to look at. So in the comparative work, we ask, where are things going well? Where are people assimilating? Where not? And what may be the cause of that? And I've done comparative research. I think one of our people was kind to mention in Canada, not comparing Canada to US, but also UK, Australia, Germany, France. Richard's book with Nancy Foner, Strangers No More, subtitled Immigration and the Challenges of Integration in North America and Europe presents a lot of data. And in the book, by the way, they use the word integration. I can tell you that they can be flexible on that, but they're not flexible on data, concepts, forget the jargon, and policy implications. And we draw the same conclusions. Basically, processes of immigrant assimilation or integration depend primarily on the characteristics of the immigrants themselves and on labor market structures, the welfare state, other institutions which define the implications of those characteristics. The process of assimilation proceeds everywhere, primarily based on those parameters. Other policies, specifically for immigrant integration, such as multiculturalism, human rights, settlements, all that, may matter, but their implication and impact is much less. It's simply not possible to alter these basic social processes very much with the kind of money being spent on these other programs. If you could, that would be the news in itself. Now, I think these findings are important for Canadians. They show that we can't rely on multiculturalism, as we often do, and the popularity of multiculturalism, to assure immigrant assimilation. We need stronger policies to promote equality of opportunity for the most disadvantaged minorities, such as Black people and Indigenous peoples who face so many more challenges. And you can draw some other policy conclusions from these findings. I mean, some aspects of multiculturalism seem to promote integration. In France, Emily summarized a little of this, but there's one particular point that I think is interesting, that they oppose multiculturalism. They have this Republican, and the hostility to headscarf means that fewer women in France, Muslim women, wear the headscarf, 10% versus 30% in Canada. But it also means that fewer Muslim women work in France. Result, Muslim household incomes are less. In Canada, multiculturalism and greater acceptance of the headscarf means higher incomes for Muslim women and greater gender equality. So multiculturalism, which is sometimes seen as undermining gender equality, we can see that it's actually, not necessarily the case. It promotes change toward the Canadian norm, promotes assimilation, you might say. I mean, it depends. We'll have to see. Second generation Muslim women are working in the labor market as much as Anglo-Canadian women, very different from their parents. But their wearing of the headscarf actually increases to 40% for those women, whereas in France, it declines to almost nothing. Another implication, of course, is the significance of labor market and related changes in Canada. And if we change the labor market as we have moving toward more knowledge-based economy, we can predict more employment difficulties for immigrants related to their qualifications and recognition of qualifications. That's exactly what is happening. In fact, I had predicted that in my book, Warmth of the Welcome, and the economists said it wasn't happening at the time. They just flat out denied it. I had one economist who had a bet. He made an open public bet. He said, "I'll bet you $100 that's not declining." This is about the late 90s, and so we bet, and it turned out that it wasn't believed by the economists until an economist had actually replicate that. They had to do that at StatCan. In fact, I know that some of them said, Reitz has done this, but can't be true, check. Then, so they checked and found it was true, and then they published it, and that's all that's cited now. But the economist even was, that the bet would be $100, said was quoted in the Globe that it was happening. And I wrote, well, where's my $100? Never got. So I do think that this kind of comparative work it's policy relevant. It's not just hairy-fairy theoretical work, as some people think of comparative research. I mentioned my final point that assimilation research has greater relevance in Canada today. Why is that? Well, it depends in a way how you define relevance, but really large-scale immigration may offset the effects in a society, the effects of assimilation, because new immigrants introduce diversity faster than assimilation attenuates it. If you're interested in the total impact that diversity is having on a society at a given moment, you can't look just at assimilation that reduces, but you have to look at the rate of immigration. And Canada not only has a high rate of immigration, it also recently doubled that rate. So for more than 2 decades, we've had 250,000 immigrants coming into Canada every year. That's about 0.75% of population. Since 2016, the numbers increased dramatically with a planned target in 2025 of 500,000, which is much more than 1% of population. We already reached 471,000 in 2023, despite the interruption of the pandemic. The public hasn't noticed this much yet, attention has been given to temporary immigration, including both migrant workers and international students, because the numbers of those have soared even more spectacularly, from under 200,000 for both categories in the year 2000 to the number in 2023, 2.3 million temporary immigrants. So it's a real question how this is going to play out. It may be fine, but Don, I'm glad you're here, because the Environics surveys, the Focus Canada surveys, in which Donna was a key player for many, many years, showed that while the series showed the majority of population in favor of the numbers of immigrants that are coming in or wanted more, that between 2022 and 2023 dropped 17 percentage points. So now it's just a bare majority. The most recent survey, it's going so fast I can't say now because that was last October, was just a bare majority in favor of immigration. So I conclude that the impact of diversity is about to increase significantly in Canada, and Canadians have not really prepared themselves. We'll see what happens, but regarding immigration, the future is not going to be the same as in the past. So those are my comments. Here's an announcement. The first one is going to make you think that what I've just said is an infomercial. But I have a new book coming out from U of T Press on Canadian immigration policies, co-authored with Nanette Kelly and Michael Trebilco, two legal scholars who had previously written a very successful history of Canadian immigration policy that ran to second edition. And I joined them to produce this book. It'll be called Reshaping the Mosaic Contemporary Canadian Immigration Policy. And I don't have any brochure, but it'll be out in the fall. And the other announcement's more personal. The book that Paul Lazarsfeld and I published in 1975 on applied policy research it was called An Introduction to Applied Sociology. It makes it sound like a textbook. That was just marketing. It was a research monograph. It'll appear in a Spanish translation next year from a foundation supporting social science research in Sevilla. And so it's the 50th anniversary of the publication of the book. It's kind of a nice excuse to go to Spain. So Don and I will go, and I have friends in Barcelona who may be listening in. Dan Rodriguez, you know Dan Rodriguez, and Joanna Friedman. I'm telling you, we're coming. And so we can have lunch now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Wendell. Thanks, Richard. Thanks to Monk staff. Let's all enjoy some lunch.